idea what happened there. None at all. And I have no idea why my camera is not really stretched. So yeah. uh, this is just weird. I don't know why every time, like there's just tech issues unnecessarily in relation to the channel. Oh Jesus. Um, it's just Streamlabs this time. It just broke. It just decided to just go and break on me. Jesus. Nope. There we go. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. So yeah, just wait for a few of the people that are on the last stream to pop back. Why does it happen though? Like someone in the chat's like, it wouldn't even be a PvP stream if there wasn't like some serious technical issue. It's like, why? Why? Oh, but why? It's like just Streamlabs just decided to just totally die. At least like we're where, like, obviously we can pick up where we're left off. Just Streamlabs. And so I'm just gonna share this because like, kind of tragic. Every time it gets going, it just. Yeah. Okay. Okay, guys. So I'm now just gonna continue, and hopefully we get a few people back. Yeah. Just destroy the viewership of the channel. Don't know why though. It's genuinely frustrating on my part because there is no reason that should have crashed. None that I'm aware of, anyway. Send. Okay, some people are starting to join now. No idea what happened. Sorry to anyone who obviously was in the last stream as well. Oh, I don't know why. I don't know why, vegan gays. I don't know why it happens. To be entirely honest with you, that's the really annoying like part of it. Is just like I don't understand what led to Streamlabs crashing, and that's why I can't take action to prevent it happening next time. Because if I understood why it wasn't happening, then like why it was happening, then I could do something about it. But because I can't do anything, because I don't know, there's nothing I can really do about it. It just crashes, and then or something happens, and then I've got to just kind of suck it up and start again, which is like destroys the stream. You can get like 50 viewers at a time, and then like you're down to 3. Hey, Wicked Fatigue, nice to have you back. All right, so the viewers are starting to pick up now. So I'm just going to start. It's going to pick up where I left off. No idea why that destroyed itself. None at all.
Because there's a zero-sum contest with the religious enthusiasm we see coming from the Muslim world. And of course, the Muslim world is all over the world at the moment. So in that contest between an older style of religiosity and theocracy, really, and
I mean, like, obviously there is like even a psychoanalytic difference between people who are fundamentalists and people who are, I want to say enlightened, but people who value reason, who take religion to be metaphorical and analogical. The difference, the fundamental difference even exists in terms of like the expression of OCD, for example, in relation to Islam. People who are Islamic followers or Jewish followers, they when they experience blasphemy as a symptom, blasphemous thoughts, intrusive thoughts, blasphemous thoughts as a symptom of OCD, they experience them very differently to a Christian. Whilst those individuals who exist in Islam and Judaism will understand blasphemy to be fear of performing the action wrong. So they'll get like intrusive acts of messing up some sort of ritual, whilst the individual who's a Christian typically has blasphemous thoughts in terms of insulting God or demonic kind of imagery. I think it's ridiculous as it sounds. I think Martin Luther King Jr. actually talked about having intrusive imagery and intrusive thoughts of the devil's backside or something. And these are the kind of differences, even at a psychoanalytic level, between the traditions. And I think that, and I would argue, fundamentally it has to do with how they are approaching religion, right? The religious individual who's fundamentalist, it has nothing to do with the agency of the individual and the right reason of the individual doing the right thing. It's about following the divine command of God. You are good when you will do as you are told. On the part of the more enlightened religious believer, you are doing good when you act in relation to the good, when you are rational and you do the right thing. And so the individual's fears are two separate, are both in relation to divine punishment, but in relation to what would instantiate wrong for each group of individuals. The fundamentalist understands wrong to be in relation to breaking a divine command, whilst the non-fundamentalist understands wrong to be in relation to an act of evil, a deliberate act of malignant intent, with malice. So I think that's a consideration. And I think that, I would argue that ultimately any religious format that doesn't value reason is dogmatic. That there is no justification for any religion or spirituality unless it can be instantiated through reason, because reason is the grounds for everything. Reason is the grounds for knowledge. And so any presuppositional view which takes a religious understanding of reality to be the foundation of reality and then inductively tries to prove anything upon that is dogmatism itself, and needs to be done away with.
Modernity, you are not as eager as I have been to pull up Western religiosity by the roots.
Or chuck the vicars.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's fair. I think I sit metaphorically as well as literally between the two of you. I realised from our conversation in Dublin some of what your concerns are about what Jordan has been saying and what he is saying, and I share some of the concern. I said to you then that I used the analogy of what our friend Eric Weinstein recently described to me as Jesus smuggling. That it was a consequence of a discussion about biologists. What do you do if you're discussing design, intelligent design? You can be okay as long as your own bandwidth on the issue, as long as your own depth of knowledge on the issue is very considerable. You can be okay discussing that biology with somebody, even a fundamentalist Christian, so long as you can follow every step of the way. But the fear will always be that the moment you're not looking, they're going to smuggle Jesus in. Or they'll wait till the moment that you're not comfortable anymore with the argument, the bit when you're at the very end of your cognitive ability, and then they'll, trust me.
There's Jesus. Yeah.
There's Jesus.
Yeah.
And one of the things I realized from Dublin was, although I think you may not think that Jordan himself is going to try Jesus smuggling on you, you fear that somewhere down the line from what he's saying, somebody else will do that trick.
Yeah, it's worse than that. I actually know the people who are clapping are doing that. I hear from those people on a daily basis, right? So that the segment of Jordan's audience that is very happy to be told they can stay on the riverbank of their traditional Christianity for the most part, and they don't have to get into the stream of totally modern, rigorous, rational thinking about everything from first principles. Right, that there's something that the Iron Age scribes got right, and it's right for all time. Those are the applause I'm hearing, and however consciously or not, Jordan is telling them it's okay to stick right.
I mean, that is kind of well poisoning. I'm just going to say that you can't just say that the people clapping in the audience are only doing so because they are, fundamentally, grounded in this religious dogmatism that essentially is being justified in the enlightened words of Peterson, but is being misconstrued and used to prop up a unenlightened philosophy or an unenlightened, theology. Now, what I would say is that it very well could be, but the same thing happens with Harris's arguments. And it's the same thing that I experience when talking about atheism or Christianity or religion as a whole online. You do find a lot of people who are incredibly dogmatic just as much on the atheist side and will point towards someone like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris as some sort of authority figure to relieve them of their rational burdens so that they can perpetuate the paradigm that they were born into or the paradigm that is most aesthetically appealing to them. And I think that this evaluation of aestheticism over genuine reason isn't something that is fundamentally related to a particular group, but is instead related, it is unfortunately the ideological underbelly of our entire civilization. This foundation that an individual is incapable of making rational decisions themselves. It's part of the reasons why we don't have genuine democracy. It's also part of the reason why individuals will seek to avoid ethics and seek pleasure in order rather than understand themselves as rational, responsible individuals. And I find that it does happen a lot in relation to atheism and a form of evolutionary naturalism or social Darwinism, in which the individual believes themselves to be an animal in the wild who is just trying to seek pleasure by any means necessary, and that religion is itself an aesthetic ideal, and so has this primordial morality about them, which is fundamentally actually a tenet of our development into capitalism and individualism, and the rejection of conceptual unity. And I would say that it's just as dogmatic as the religious believer who is abstract and lofty and believes that an individual will be condemned to a life an eternal damnation for making a life choice in relation to their sexual preferences. It's unbelievably self-suiting and self-soothing in relation to relieving the existential crisis of individuals, both sides incapable of actually grasping their responsibility to seek the real, and instead fundamentally relying upon an authority figure and ideology to instantiate their worldviews, to give them hegemonically their understanding of reality, so that they can escape the very responsibility, that reason and rationality that is being perpetuated by both sides. So what we have is two intellectual figures being used to perpetuate a dogmatism without actually considering the concepts that they are actually trying to perpetuate. Now, that's not to say that there is anything wrong with the arguments of Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris. It's to say that there is something wrong culturally with the individuals who seek to mitigate their responsibility to one another, or seek to mitigate their responsibility in understanding their responsibility, who reject their choice to be a chooser. And that's an existential problem within our culture. And I think that happens on both sides.
Right there with a shard of the cross.
Okay, well, in Dublin, I actually tried a little conscious Jesus smuggling on Sam to see how that would go in a discussion we had about the central archetype of superheroes, but I'm going to try something a little different tonight. I'm going to try a little direct God smuggling. We won't bother with Jesus. Let's go right to God. Why not? So one of the things I've really tried to do when I've been analyzing religious texts is to take them seriously, in the sense that I don't presume that I understand them. And I presume that they're a mystery of sorts. And at least the Bible, for example, is a mystery because we don't really understand the processes by which it was constructed, and we don't understand the processes by which we all agreed collectively over several thousand years to organize the book the way it is organized, or to edit it the way that it's edited, or to keep what's in it and to discard what's not in it.
There's a lot of historical power also in relation to how it's edited, and what was kept and what was gotten rid of. The very famously burnt some of the Gospels, apparently. I remember hearing about that, the church actively destroying aspects of the Bible, and in relation to what justified the power structures at the time. And so the Bible is being edited by humans, and humans, although there might have been a theological grounding for a lot of it, in relation to, let's say, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, the prime figures of Catholicism, which were in relation to where the Bible was edited in the first place, there was also a great deal of power. And that, I don't think, can be divorced away from an understanding of the Bible as well. And I think that needs to be considered.
Why it's lasted and why it's had such a huge impact.
I don't want to derail you, but we do understand that the first part of the process all too well. We know that there was a political and all too human process of voting certain texts in for inclusion, and some were in for centuries and then got jettisoned, and Revelation came in far later than. There were whole generations of Christians who lived and died under the banner of the Bible, and it was a different Bible at the time. They had the wrong Bible. So
but it's the same issue that we really don't understand. Fair enough, Sam. And I'm not saying that political, etc., considerations didn't enter into it. I'm sure all human considerations entered into it, but there was some collective process of winnowing, and you can attempt to reduce that to economic or political causes, which is generally what secular assessors,
which I don't think is fair in the first place, because obviously there is the reasons what the original authors wrote it, and obviously those individuals who are in power or have a political ideology in relation to them in the first place. I think it would be, although there have been many evil and corrupt popes and power structures within Catholicism, it would be wrong to dismiss them as not being representative of their time, even as egoists, even in their understanding of themselves. They were pre-individualistic. So even when they are trying to fulfill their own ends, their understanding of their own ends was in relation to the concepts which were available at that time. And so, an understanding of power being separate and in relation to, let's say, an evolutionary biological position would already presume that there is a foundation from which the individual is actually seeking the end goal, but understanding that the individuals who are modifying and editing their Bible, even in relation to their ends, were doing so in relation to an understanding of self, which was being conceptually bettered by the institutions which existed around them, which is why self-consciousness and self-understanding is a process which is under a constant perpetual upward curve for Hegel, in which the concepts are constantly renewing and bettering themselves. So even at the points of editing, we need to consider why the editing would have been valuable for the people in power, yes, but understanding the people in power and who they were and why they thought the way they did and how they even thought to seek their own ends is just as important, which is why you can't ideologically divest power from the individuals who are enacting it.
Like Freud and Marx both did, and with a fair degree of success, I might add, but there's still some mysterious assessment of what it is that will be remembered that entered into it. But it's a separate point to some degree. But I'm just saying that my point of departure when looking at these texts is one of an essential radical ignorance. I don't assume that I understand the mechanisms by which they were generated or edited or collected or kept or remembered, or why they had the impact they had. Now, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of, let's say, God the Father, because that's a very common archetypal representation of God the Father. So I'm going to tell you an experience that I had that I've never really told any audience about. I had a vision at one point and the vision had to do with a dialogue that I was having with my father. And you have a father, right? And when you're a little kid, you act out your father when you pretend to be a father. And what you're doing when you're acting out your father isn't imitating your father, because you don't duplicate precisely the actions that your father ever took in his life. What you do is you watch your father across multiple contexts and you abstract out something like a spirit of the father. And then when you're a child, you implement that spirit of the father in your pretend play, and you come to
100% agree. And this is, I would say, in relation to the good, in the considerations of evil. There is an abstract concept from which we understand reality. Now, I wouldn't say that it's abstracted as if we remove it, but in our attempting to understand and emulate, then what we have is a understanding of what it means to be a father, what it means to be a son, the dynamics that is going on. And fundamentally, there is something within that in which we are given an alternative position. By understanding what it means to have a good father and what it means to be a son, you can understand the responsibilities of the father differently in relation to what the father is doing to you, which gives you almost a perceptual advantage in which the individual who is, the father or the mother or whoever it is reinstitutionalizing the concepts from which they use when they are being applied and they are being observed and perpetually bettered by the reasoning of the individual and the generation that comes after them, which is what I think we tend to see in terms of ethics, a constant, and not just ethics, but in terms of concepts as a whole, a constant an evaluative process upon our conceptual mechanisms which lead us towards a better understanding of reality in relation to our responsibilities to ourselves and others.
Embody that deeply. So the notion is that people can abstract out something like a spirit of the father, and that's part of our mimetic tendency, which is a very powerful human cognitive tendency. And in this vision, I first started to talk with my father, and I would say more with the spirit of my father, because he wasn't actually there. And I would say it was the wisest part of him. And then that sort of transformed into a discussion that I had with a series of ancestral spirits, and then that transformed itself into a vision of God himself, with whom I had a conversation. And this was a visionary experience. And then that all went away, and I spent months and months thinking about it. And I thought, so you guys can tell me what you think about this. And this sort of stretches my cognitive ability to its utmost limit to contemplate such things. But here's a biological argument. I already made the case that a child can...
Why can't you just keep it conceptual, Jordan? No. Naughty psychologist. Stop trying to relate it to some sort of brain state.
Extract out the spirit of the Father and embody it, and that's necessary insofar as you're going to be a father and a wise one. But we can also extract out the spirit of the Father over much longer periods of time, because my father was a father because he imitated his father, who imitated his father, who imitated his father, as far back in time as you can go. And there's a cumulative development of the spirit of the Father across time. Now then the
Absolutely, and I would say that this is fundamentally Hegelian in many ways. It's not just the spirit of the Father, but it's the conceptual awareness of the individuals that exist in any system is fundamentally dependent upon our understanding of our understanding of self, and our understanding of our world is the conceptual development that has been going on for thousands of years. And I would say this is what has led to improvement in the first place. And obviously, an understanding of self, an understanding of one's position in the world, also can then lead to a rejection of this system. Like, you could reject certain amounts of dogmatism. I don't reject religion as a whole, but I certainly would think that it could be argued that the individual, let's say like Nietzsche, who argues that God is dead, could show that the value of religion is fundamentally gone to us, is dead to us. We don't need it anymore. That its utility in relation to our understanding of reality is no more. And I think that's what Sam would probably say in relation to our understanding of the real, and instead is, has utility in maybe in terms of our imaginative and creative endeavors, but which are in and of themselves dismissed as less valuable in the scientific paradigm. So, him even allowing, spiritualism to enact in a position of art and creativity, I think only shows his disdain for art and creativity as being less essential for human life. Art and creativity are irrational, yet the science is reason incarnate. And I think that both of those positions are fundamentally wrong. Like, you cannot see that reason to be embedded in only one form of signification and not another. Reason is our signification. Reason is the meaning that exists between us. And so when reason exists in an abstract form, in a lofty, otherworldly form, which is yet to be fully understood and contemplated, it does not dismiss its value in relation to human life and is not more or less rational. The whole point of reason in terms of our earthly here and now is to show that the only way that we can gain knowledge is by moving, and this is very Aristotelian, by moving from what we can know to what is knowable. And that is the movement towards an end goal. And I think that understanding it to be purely reductionary or reductionist in origin fundamentally is an over-evaluation of the status quo, rather than an evaluation of reason itself. It is seeing reason and the way that it is used through the scientific paradigm, which we see all too often.
The question might be, does this spirit of the Father have any reality other than the metaphorical? And I would say, damn right it has a reality, and I can describe a biological reality, and I don't know what this says about any background metaphysics, but here's a hypothesis. We know that human beings separated from chimpanzees over the course of the last 7 million years, at least in large part because of human female sexual selectivity. So it was the spirit of femininity collectively that helped elevate us to the degree that we have been elevated above our chimpanzee co-ancestor. But here's something interesting to contemplate. What is it precisely that makes men desirable to women? And so I have a bit of a hypothesis about that. So here's what men do.
Is this the philosophy of the daddy kink now? Is that where we are? Like women like daddies, man. That's where we are. That's why we're here. The spirit of the Father, the evaluation of God. God is the biggest daddy of all. Women like God because of that. Therefore, we should emulate God. There we go.
They get together in productive groups, and they orient themselves toward a certain task.
Oh, it was like a noise there. Just making sure everything was okay.
And they produce a hierarchy around that task, because whenever you implement a task, you produce a hierarchy. And they vote up the most competent men to the top of the hierarchy, and then the women select the competent men from the top of the hierarchy. But the vote that determines who the competent men are that are more likely to reproduce is a consequence of male evaluation of men, and that's occurred over millennia. And so there's a spirit of the father that's embedded in the patriarchal hierarchy that acts as the primary selection mechanism that offers men up to women and plays a cardinal role in human evolution.
I mean, you really don't need the reductionist position for this. But yeah, like, you really don't need the reductionism for this in relation to human evolutionary, figures. I mean, what we can say is that obviously the patriarchal understanding of an individual's role has been modified just as much by women as it has been by men. Because even if we took patriarchy to be the case, an understanding of the master-slave relationship is dependent upon the slave's participation. And in the case of men, especially men and women, what evaluates a man as being, desirable to women is just as much, an action between the dynamic of men and women as a whole. And so the evaluation of women understanding, masculinity and the performance of masculinity has created, I would say, and I would agree with this, a certain norm and convention in relation to self-understanding, which has been perpetuated on and on. But then understanding that to be fundamentally reductionist is, I think, a bit of a jump. And then I think that understanding that to be the spirit of the father more than anything being in relation to the sexual reproduction and having an evolutionary purport is again a bit of a jump. It has more to do with cultural development and a socio-historical paradigm. And so we can understand that the understanding of patriarchy or patriarchal roles has been fundamentally tempered by the development of culture. And I don't think anyone would necessarily disagree with that. And so it's the same thing in our stories. Like our stories and our parables and our understanding of reality, our myths represent ways of living. And the end goals of those myths represent our ways of living. And the God the Father is fundamentally the most abstract understanding of what it means to live the good life. And it just so happens to be that the one that understands the good life is masculine. And that's probably the attribution of masculinity and reason as being, is in a somewhat dogmatism, in a somewhat dogmatic way. So that could arguably be critiqued. And that's without even considering the fact that the understanding of God fundamentally for each generation is different in and of itself. The true loftiness and abstractness of God, the Father, means that he is never known by the individual as a earthly here and now, as Jesus is known, but is known in relation to a abstract principle of right. And that leaves an incredible amount of leeway to the socio-political development of those individuals who understand and worship God. Who are they worshipping? What does he do? And why does he do it? And what will be rewarded when they do that? Fundamentally, even if we understand that, in terms of patriarchal roles, there is a more akin to Jesus than I would say God the Father. God the Father is the ultimate father in the sense that he's always right, and I think that it's the same thing. I think with any parent, they're always right. And there is an authority there. And I think that the only thing that is manifested in God the Father that is not in God the Son is in Jesus is the authority of God. And I think that itself is like obviously the abstract divinity of God, but the authority is the only way in which we come into dynamic with God. And I think that has been a fundamental paradigm that has been perpetuated from the Judeo understandings of God. but also in our movement towards Jesus. Jesus as a man constantly changes. Like, what would Jesus do? He's a contextual figure, but he's also relative and relatable, rather. And so God the Father is not, but God the Father is always the one who creates and perpetuates the divinity within Jesus. Jesus himself can make mistakes, while God cannot. God himself is people talk about him in theology as an abstract, like the Godhead, that we would never come to know the infinite that is God. And so the understanding of God itself is fundamentally dependent upon our understanding of masculinity then again, because it comes to this understanding of, what is the role of the masculine in relation to this paradigm that is then being created. So as soon as we have an ideological structure, it starts modifying reality in its own image. And so understanding it to be related to this image and this, evolutionary background is almost question begging as well, because then we are presuming that the foundation of the ideology and the justification of the ideology is natural when we are viewing nature itself through that ideology.
And it looks like we've personified that spirit of the Father in our religious imagery. And that's how it looks to me. But then there's something that's even more mysterious and deep about that's worth considering, is that apparently the entire course of evolutionary history has conspired to produce human beings. And we could argue that it could have been different, but it certainly hasn't been different. And that means that selective spirit of the Father has been part of the process that's generated our very being, and it's certainly possible that collective spirit of the Father reflects something metaphysically fundamental about the structure of reality itself.
Wait, I was with you up until the last sentence, yes. Well, insofar as I agree with virtually all of that, I should say that none of that should give comfort to people who want to hold on to this notion that certain of our books might have been revealed by the creator of the universe. Right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the creator.
Yeah. I'm just saying that the world we're living in now is one in which we have whole societies shattered over this notion that some books weren't written by human beings. Right? There's a different class of book. Right? There's a different shelf in the library where the products of almost certainly merely human brains are venerated for all time and considered uneditable and unignorable by the majority of human beings.
Yeah, well, it's clear that revelation can devolve into fundamentalism, and that's a real problem.
So there is a risk in all this always, is an often made critique, but that when you're talking about religion, you're talking about the Inquisition, you're talking about the jihadists, you're not talking about somebody who wants to go to their local Anglican church once a year, maybe get the children into school, and maybe when they're at some desolate moment of their lives returns to this as the place that stores meaning. I mean, the thing that I think Jordan and I are in agreement on in this is that thing, with quote from Schopenhauer in the Dialogue on Religion, when he says, that truth may be like water, it needs vessels to carry it. And when we were talking about this the other night, you admitted that one of the consequences, perhaps, of the parents sort of going through the belief structures they may not believe in anymore, but they keep doing it, is a demonstration of what you said was the non-embarrassing options that atheists have come up with. But it may also be that since we don't have very many vessels, that cracked and damaged and sometimes transparent as they are, what vessels you have might be worth holding on to.
Well, no, I think
there is actually a really sound argument to be made there in relation to the concepts and the way that they are housed within a language community, and how we understand reality isn't abstracted from a purely physicalist domain, but it entails the engagement and conceptualization of that domain by agents. And so the absolute rejection of a given language community without understanding the value that could exist within it is a form of dogmatism in and of itself, as it rejects the positive authority that can exist within that language community, regardless of its past historical understanding. the way in which we approach it now should be rational, and so the absolute rejection of it, because of its aestheticism within society and its its prior instantiation is ironically dogmatic in relation to the way I think that a lot of atheists do approach religion. They see it as valueless for what it is without actually evaluating what it is.
The challenge here is, I mean, it feels that, well, first of all, we should first notice that these comments very often take the form of, you and I don't need this stuff, but most other people do, right? And that is,
it can do that,
yes, I mean, that's inevitably, and it sort of took that form at one moment the other night, where you acknowledge that people of low intelligence are best placed in a conservative paradigm, a traditionally conservative paradigm, because there's less to think through. Right now, obviously, you don't want your view on religion summarized by "it's good for stupid people."
Well, I do want it summarized to some degree that way, because one of the things we do.
I'm giving you the opportunity again to put this foot in your mouth.
But I would say not only. I mean, the thing is that we're all stupid, and some of us are far stupider than others.
But we're not that stupid. I mean,
but there's another problem, Sam. I think, and this is obviously a contentious one. One of the things I don't go to church, but there is one thing I admire about the church, and that is that it's managed to serve.
Oh, thank you very much for the donation, John Buck. Came in late, but looking forward to listening to this later. Thank you for doing this. No problem. I appreciate the donation, and thank you very much.
Serve as a repository for these fundamental underlying fictions for 2 millennia. And that's really something bloody unbelievable. I mean, the great, what would you say?
It is bloody unbelievable.
Well, look, Sam, everything's soaked in blood. We have no disagreement about that, but the secular alternatives that we produced in the 20th century were certainly no less blood-sodden, and they produced nothing of any productivity whatsoever.
We did not do it now, but we have to put to bed that secular canard.
What would you do?
Well, it's just not so that Stalinism was the product of secularism or atheism, and nor were
well, it was
fascism.
A product. It wasn't an inevitable product or the product.
It wasn't. And please, anyone who has this meme in your head, please just allow the next sentences I speak to just push it out, because I'm so sick of hearing this. This idea that the greatest crimes of the 20th century were somehow the product of atheism. Right. When you look at what actually engineered these atrocities, it was something that looked very much like a religion. It was a religion in every way apart from an explicit commitment to otherworldliness. It was based on
that's a big difference.
Dogmatism through.
Yeah, but that is all irrationality, right? That is all basically all forms of ethical catastrophe of being the product, and I think that is unbelievably well established now, of an irrationality of the agent and the caprice of the individual over what is actually genuinely instantiated through a genuine ethical discourse. Stalin himself, obviously moving from Karl Marx. Karl Marx took a materialist view of the world, and that can't be denied. And the reason that Karl Marx took that view of the world wasn't because of religion. And I think that it might have genuinely been from a rejection of it, an understanding of power structures that existed within it. Now, that was a rational position for him to hold, wrong, I would argue, but rational in many ways. And he certainly understood the way that power worked. Now, Stalin ran with those ideas and placed himself as the foundation of ethics. And I think that ultimately every single act of catastrophe and unjustified, act of human catastrophe and tragedy and evil especially, has been the perpetuation of one's own rationality and one's own judgment above the judgment of others, above the judgment of genuine rational discourse and ethics as a whole. And this is why I would say that ultimately it's subjectivism, and it's the irony of the subjectivist, as I think Hegel calls it, that is the genuine threat that is perpetuated through all paradigms. That the individual sees the antithesis or the synthesis or the thesis as being the fundamental right way from which they must inform the world of, and force that view upon others without considering their reason and their capacities. And this is the over-evaluation of one's own judgment, which is why it's inherently subjective. It relies upon the individual deciding for themselves, even if it is a rational mechanism they are using, a quote-unquote rational mechanism, even if it is a valid way of thinking, it loses its soundness. It becomes perverse and dogmatic and becomes abstract and caprice within that individual. And that's something that could be said of Stalin. It's something that could be said of Hitler. But it's also something that could be said of the ancient Christians. It's something that could also be said of the fundamentalist Christians today, of the fundamentalist, the jihadis in relation to, committing holy wars. It's also something that could be said of individuals who reject, the betterment of everyone for a hedonistic, egoistic worldview, which is arguably the philosophical child of atheist individualism. And so what we have is forms of subjective dogmatism being a byproduct of irrational behavior, which is, I think, universal. It's not something that is as universal as bad thinking, and it's not present in a single individual or a single ideology. It's present in all ideology. It is the fundamental reason why it is fundamental human bias.
And through, it was based on personality cults that grew up around figures like Stalin and Hitler and Mao. It was not the ideas of Bertrand Russell and David Hume that brought us to the Gulag or to Auschwitz.
Yes, but then you can't say it's the thought of Jesus Christ either. I mean,
well, no, it's true. No, I can say that. I can say it was the thought of St. Augustine, and I can say it was the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas explicitly that gave us the Inquisition. This is a fact.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a general one as well as one for tonight, but the whole discussion, I mean, I said the other night in Dublin that to a great extent, when the history books are written about the period we're living in, they'll probably be described as the post-Holocaust period in history, the post-World War II era in Europe. It's still going on. So we're still going through this, trying to work out what happened. And I have to say, one thing that I, at any rate, am equally tired of is the claim that this has got to be a tennis game between the religious and the non-religious. That people say that the 20th century's crimes were committed by atheists. Sometimes true, often wrong. Or that the 20th century's crimes were committed by people who were religious. Sometimes true, often wrong.
But you're not observing a crucial distinction here, because I would never be tempted to hold religion accountable for the bad things that religious people do that have no connection to religion. Right? So if a Muslim robs a liquor store, I'm not going to blame Islam for that. Right? There's no doctrine. There's no doctrine.
Especially not then.
There's no doctrine that makes sense of that behavior. What I blame religion for, and likewise, there's no doctrine in the mere loss of religion, i.e. atheism, that gets you the Gulag.
Well,
right?
hang on. Well, there is.
No, there's not. But let me just flesh out this point for one more second. The only thing I
mean, arguably the instantiation of the material and the material conditions, which are the contention between the individuals and their understanding of themselves in relation to the understanding of the power structures of the time, which Karl Marx talked about, was perpetuated by the anti-religious standpoint, because the metaphysical foundation of all of this was, the earthly here and now, which had relation to desire and the individual's, ability to express desire in a way which reflected almost a Hobbesian understanding of the world. And I think they could make an argument to say that led to the Gulag, especially in relation to, the refinement of the material conditions and the way in which, certain classes of individuals were, stripped of wealth and, dismissed without consideration as being, even human or deserving of value. I think that ultimately is it holds within it the same negative that is in atheism, and that is the skepticism of one's ethical paradigms in relation to a form of an antithesis of those paradigms, an over-evaluation of the negative position without consideration that there was good in the positive and even true and right in the positive. There's actually a famous quote from Hegel, which says, "The realm of fact discards its barbarity and its unrighteous caprice, while the realm of truth has abandoned the world of beyond and its arbitrary force," talking about the absolute spirit. The realm of fact discards its barbarity and unrighteous caprice. The individual who believes themselves to be true in and of themselves, that their judgment represents a one-to-one ratio of reality, is usually dogmatic in origin and is reliant upon a subjective instantiation of what is actually right and wrong. Whilst the realm of truth, in relation to what is ultimately infinite and arguably unknowable, or that is, which is not knowable at this point in time at the very least, is otherworldly and beyond any understanding. And so although it has strength and force to it, it lacks grounding and meaning, and so is an empty signification. And so what we need is emergence of those two aspects of human life, which is why the spiritual and the spirit in Hegel needs to become an earthly here and now. And that's what I would say is the fundamental unity between reason and spirituality, or reason and or institutions in today.
I blame religion for are the things that it becomes rational to do by the light of these beliefs. If you accept these doctrines, a rational and good person can be tempted to join ISIS. That's my concern. Okay. A rational and good person can be tempted to...
But that is a very specific religion. The reality is that fundamentalist religions reject the tenets of reason in the first place. They are that abstract, otherworldly force. They represent an ideology which is fundamentally so abstract that no real meaning can be found and can be used to justify next to anything. And especially the justify power structures with ease. Now, the issue with atheism, or especially dogmatic atheism, really, it's not atheism itself, it's a form of dogmatic atheism, really can be used to dismiss the value that exists within institutions which would otherwise prevent catastrophe. Like, so, for example, I think it was a conscientious objector in World War II who was a Christian, was it World War One? I can't remember, wrote a letter to both the British and the German governments saying that they were disgusted that two Christian countries could go to war. Now, it very well might be the case that the ideology of Christianity led to these wars, but it's very well the case as well that the ideology of Christianity condemned these wars, just as much as the ideology, the negative that exists in atheism, would reject the uninstantiated caprice of the agent as being irrational because of its skeptic position. It would say that, look, this position's just as irrational as the last one. But the issue is, all ideology masquerades itself as being the fact, as being truth, as being a one-to-one ratio with reality. And what we need to do is instantiate a rational disposition towards any and all tradition and ideology.
Support the Inquisition.
But of the many things they had in common, this is the point that David Berlinski made in his book, what did the NKVD have in common with everyone who oversaw the Gulag, the SS, the people who guarded the camps, the people who put people on trains? What did they all have in common? What did they have in common with Mao? Among other things, they had in common the fact that none of them thought that God was watching them. none of them thought that they were being observed and would be held accountable.
It doesn't help when you think God is on your side. We have just as many examples where people do it because they think God is on their side, right?
Sure.
God is watching and clapping.
I'm not denying that. I'm saying that the attempt to make this a tennis match over the 20th century is a mistake. We're still trying to work out what caused it. Religion had a role, atheism had a role. But the perpetual tennis match of it.
What caused it was the subjective caprice of the individuals who perpetuated a dogmatic and evil regime. I think that is unbelievably observable. Whether it was ideologically the product of, Christianity or atheism is besides the point. What is the point in the first place is the lack of rationality within those people who commit evil acts.
I think.
Well, and there is something to be said at a more sophisticated level, I would say, for the idea that you have an obligation to a transcendent ethic. Now, you make that claim in the moral landscape. You lay out a transcendent ethic, in my estimation. That's one that puts the onus of responsibility on the individual to act in a way that, at minimum, minimizes suffering. And you think of that as a statement of fact, that's the proper way of being, and I think about it as an axiomatic statement of faith, and that's one of our differences.
And they are both unbelievably wrong, because that's why they have to logically instantiate their positions with presupposition rather than rationally founded their positions upon the dialectic. I would relate it to what is justified, and then obviously the movement towards the abstract is the hermeneutic evaluation of our current ethic, but isn't the establishment of ethics, which is a here and now, which exists between agents. It's the understanding of this relationship in terms of the infinite experience of reality that is the abstract. And so there is no separation really between the individual, between the earthly here and now and the abstract spiritual force. The combination of the two exist in reality as it is, in the appropriate and proper understanding of reality through reason. And that is what we really need to consider within this. It's like, okay, it very well may be the case that there is a vestige of faith in the purely abstract, but that faith doesn't guide our actions, because if it did guide our actions, then we would be just as likely to commit acts of evil and malice, which are justified through revelation or some sort of dogmatism, without like an earthly here and now in relation to who is actually considerable and why. And the same can be said for the earthly here and now. We will end up in a bias. We will be forced into understanding ourselves as being justified, or this paradigm as being justified and non-criticable. Not open to genuine discourse in relation to what should be the case. And that's why I think that this is resolved in a hermeneutic relationship, which says, man by nature is not what he should be. And that is a Hegel quote again.
I have been very careful in my analysis of the relationship between the idea of sovereignty and the idea of religious belief. And one of the things that I have worked out, I think, partly from reading such people as Eliade and Jung, was that there is an emergent idea of sovereignty that does involve being accountable to a God. And here's how I would justify that. And I would think about this essentially from a practical and biological perspective, independent of any metaphysical reality that it might have. So the ancient Mesopotamians, for example, believed that their emperor was the incarnation or the representative of a god named Marduk. And that actually bestowed certain ethical responsibilities on the ruler. And so the ruler had to be a good Marduk in order to be a sovereign, to be regarded as sovereign. He had to be the embodiment of these divine principles. And it took the Mesopotamian...
The issue is the power structures which perpetuate the divine principles in the first place are an earthly here and now. And so what the abstract right is always confined to some degree by the ideology of the people who exist and understand it.
a very, very long period of time, perhaps several tens of thousands of years. They weren't Mesopotamian during that whole time, obviously, to work out what those principles of sovereignty should be. And the Mesopotamians encoded this in their fictions, in their religious fictions, making essentially the proposition that the proper ruler had to have eyes all the way around his head, because that was one of the attributes of Marduk. So he was someone who was genuinely paying attention, who was capable of coming into voluntary contact with the great chaotic substructure of being and cutting it into pieces and making the habitable world, and also speaking words that were truthful, that had the power, the magic power of truth. And the ruler had to act that out if he was going to be the sort of ruler that his people weren't entitled to slay and sacrifice. And then once a year at the New Year's festival, he would go outside the city, the walled city, and he would act out his role of Marduk. And the priest would humiliate him and ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, so that he could remember that he had a responsibility to undertake this to embody this relationship with these divine principles. And the thing that's so important about this, that's so absolutely crucially important, is that it established the principle that even if you were at the top of a hierarchy, you weren't absolute. There was something above you that...
But that is also a power check created by a religious institution which was ultimately itself trying to seize power. And what we have is also a dynamic ideologically between various classes of individuals, which would be open to a Nietzschean critique in terms of the genealogy of those ethics in the first place.
That you were subordinate to. And one of the extraordinarily useful ideas about the abstraction of even God as a personified spirit, let's say, is that it allows every leader to be subordinate to something that's beyond him. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be misused, but it's a very, very, very important idea.
Yeah, except you can get there the other way around. You can realize that even if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you are radically dependent on everyone else. The tip of the pyramid...
but everybody at the tip of a hierarchy doesn't believe that. Sometimes they believe that they can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, but I'm saying, if you're going to believe something...
Which is arguably an abstract, just the same way as he talks about this abstract above. Understanding yourself to be a god in the first place is an abstract understanding, and the caprice, I think, that is showing on the side of the individual, which is why we need a combination of a dynamic between individuals and an evaluation of that dynamic through an internal mechanism, and obviously open to its absolute negation, that it is entirely false. And I think the idea of an absolute falsifies everything that we do, showing that it is ultimately foundationless. It's the movement of skepticism just as much as it's the perpetuation of philosophy, and I think that both of these positions are incredibly valuable. But I think that both sides just want to instantiate themselves above the other. That is, and especially if I'm honest, I do think that Harris's position really does want to do away with the institutions of religion because of the harm done, because he thinks it would do more good. But I am very doubtful that it would do any more good. And I think that the existential crisis of individuals today is definitely tied to the rejection of religion. That's not to say that it was a bad thing, but that we need to understand the individual in relation to those ethical paradigms that existed within religion and keep the good within them, whilst rejecting the bad.
Compatible with rationality.
There's no need to start philosophy again. That's basically what I'm saying.
Globally, and has the least conceivable downside. I would put in that place not a superstitious attachment to a notion of an invisible friend or punisher who's above you. I would put in its place the totally defensible and palpably true fact that you could be the king of the world, and you are dependent on everyone around you to eat, to not be murdered by them. I mean, you are. I mean, it's amazing how precarious.
I would agree, and I think that an understanding of ethics being founded not in religion and revelation, but in reason itself, and the perpetuation of the relationship between individuals is the way that we should understand it, and it is the bottom of the dialectic. Although I know he doesn't know how to do it, a good way to do it would be in a Hegelian sense, and understanding the individual self-understanding and the perpetuation of desire is only possible in between individuals. And so the expression of subjectivity itself, which is the overall arcing goal of any individual, is fundamentally dependent upon its objectivity, which exists between agents. And so even to understand one's own preferences requires the engagement of others.
Even a totalitarian regime is. I mean, the amazing thing is that these last at all, because in many cases it would just take 50 people to act in unison to kill the tyrant, right? But it never happens because you just have a first mover problem. Everyone is afraid to be the first person shot. But it is a genuine mystery that these systems even perpetuate themselves. And when they unravel, when you see, Gaddafi being murdered in a crowd, you realize, wow, it really is just a matter of the restraint and fear of human beings keeping any of these things together. A benign, if you wanted a hierarchy where you had a kind of benign philosopher king.
But then, obviously, that ideologically works both ways. The individual is scared for themselves because they evaluate themselves above, abstract concepts such as liberty, justice, etc., which is just as much an issue with idealizing, obviously, a power structure based on the same kind of ideology, where you go, or the opposite ideology, where this person is a divine king, and instantiated by, God himself. Both lead to a rejection of acting justly. And a lot of the time, I think individuals use, as I said, especially in our society today, both sides as an existentialist crutch.
Pulling the reins of a society. I'm not saying we do, but even there, you could have an ethical one. You could have one where, and a non-superstitious one where someone recognized, hey, this is how we're doing it, but we are radically, at the top of this hierarchy, am radically dependent on being surrounded by as many happy people as possible.
Well, look, I mean, I don't.
Well, that's not necessarily the case as well. Obviously, being the top of the hierarchy, I think Machiavelli showed this much better than what he's just said. It's not actually about being. There's two things to play, and I think there's a very famous. There's one, there's Sun Tzu, who says, the greatest wars are won without fighting, but and basically shows the power of ideology itself being fundamentally of greater force than any genuine action within the world. But the thing that Machiavelli shows is that people are far motivated by fear than they are by pleasure. People are much more scared of the threat of force and death than they are, the value of a given end, the pleasure that they would experience. Although both are motivators, and so saying that the tyrant is should understand that to be loved will ultimately create a fair and just system. Creating a fair and just system, and to be loved is tantamount to his power and his authority, would be a misunderstanding, because the reality is the tyrant and the despot sees themselves as the fundamental arc of justice in the first place, so the assurance of their power is the only thing that matters. And so if they can do it through terroristic means, then it is justified through their subjective caprice. So simply understanding it to be look, they would sustain their own power if they were loved, is a misunderstanding. They could also take the opposite stance, that actually, look, suffering and terrorism is by far a more motivating force upon the population for servitude, and so I will use that. So that needs to be considered. And obviously there's the tyrant that can use both, which is Machiavelli's prince.
Some profound sense, I don't disagree with
we're
that.
Actually, this sounds like a fiction, but we're living with this problem, and we encounter this more and more when you talk, in Silicon Valley, as you and I occasionally do, and I'm sure you do as well, where you meet people who are fantastically wealthy, who seem uncannily detached at the detached at the fact that there's this growing chasm between them and those they know and the rest of humanity, and you begins to wonder what level of wealth inequality will everyone find alarming. And some people are acting as though there is no level that is alarming, that there's a kind of a law of nature that this thing can grow just impossibly to the point where we have trillionaires walking around.
But this is the issue. Like, what is the ethical foundation in the first place? Now, I do actually agree with Harris here in saying that it needs to be grounded within reality itself and what we can know. And what we do know is the fundamental necessity of individuals and other individuals and collective efforts in understanding ourselves and ethics as a whole. So we cannot deny the value of another individual's ability of approval and dismissal. Otherwise, we reject knowledge itself and fall into absurdism. But although he doesn't really argue for that, he just talks about bootstraps and shit. But I would say that is the foundation of ethics. But then what we risk then is falling into tribalism if we don't have an evaluative mechanism that creates abstract and lofty concepts which may seem unreachable, at least beyond the current paradigm that exists today, which is arguably the benefit of something like Jesus, where it is that kind of middle ground between the abstract, unknowable, and that which is knowable but contains within it something better and more abstract. And so Jesus is a constantly perpetuating better. He is God in human form. He is the divinity that exists within us. He is the movement of ethics forward. And that is obviously a very metaphorical understanding of Jesus, and it's something that is definitely in relation to Hegel. But the reality is that our understanding of ethics as a whole needs to be both abstract and universal and individualistic to have any real merit within our understanding.
And in driving in their motorcades, and it's kind of it's sort of the libertarian religion one occasionally runs into, and clearly there's some level of inequality that's untenable, or at least would be undesirable.
It's a funny thing, because that's a place where our thought loops and then agrees to some degree again, because I do believe that you can, in some sense, rationally derive an ethic. So let's take the argument that you put forward and say that, well, and this is an extension of your well-being argument to some degree, which I've thought about a fair bit. It's like, well, okay, what's the optimal solution for you? Well, first of all, there isn't just you now. There's you now, and you tomorrow, and you next week, and you in a year, you in 5 years. So there's you and the you that propagates across time. So one of the implications of that is that you can't do anything that's really good for the you now that isn't very good for you a week from now, right? Yeah. So that means you have to imagine yourself as multiple individuals across multiple time frames. And then you have to figure out what's good for all those individuals across all those time frames, although you discount the future to some degree because of its unpredictability. But then, so that's a very tight set of constraints. And you might say, well, a rational person...
Yeah, that's that would be obviously an understanding of the individual and the self through time, and the understanding of value through time, and the understanding of self in relation to others, which is, I think, where they both agree, essentially, and that's probably a reflection of more probably their childhoods and the way they were raised necessarily than the metaphysical foundations of their positions that they both are, I think, very much inductively want to prove. The normative theories from which they were raised into, and the understandings of value in which they were raised into, rather than understanding axiologically the foundations of value itself. And so they're coming to the same conclusions because they are using right reason in relation to the evaluation of an individual as having been an end in themselves.
Person would calculate what was optimal across all those multiple time frames. Then you do the same thing with other people, which is the point you just made. Well, it isn't just you, because who's you? There's you and your family, and most people are in a situation where they would regard damage to their family as perhaps even worse than damage to them. So
Right.
whatever they are obviously encapsulates their family, and then to some degree that flows off into the community. And so there is no isolated you, and that's sort of your
Yes,
point with
yes.
regards to the ethic. But then, so I agree with all that, but then one of the things that I would suggest is that, because that's an incredibly difficult rational calculation, and perhaps an impossible one, technically speaking, but certainly very difficult, that what has happened in part as our great narratives have emerged across time is that we have observed ourselves attempting to solve that multiple identity, multiple time frame problem, and we've told stories about people who do that exceptionally well, and then we've winnowed out those stories and we've produced these powerful narratives that encapsulate the ethic that does in fact reflect that wisdom.
Yeah.
And so and I think you actually accept some of that in your moral propositions, which is something that we've talked about before. So for example, although never really agreed on, you certainly believe, for example, that the embodiment of truth is one of the means whereby you solve the problem of ethics. And I would say that that's a deeply rooted Judeo-Christian concept, that
It's
the truth
it's so
above
deeply
all.
rooted that it precedes any notion of religious provincialism. I mean, it's deeper than Judeo-Christian. It's deeper than our humanity on some level. At one point, we talked about the golden rule, and I said that the precursor to the golden rule can be found even among monkeys, right?
Right.
Okay. Wait a minute. This is where they both lose me. Okay. Why are we going reductionist again? Why do we need to look at monkeys to understand the foundations of ethics? Why can't we just say what we talk about metaphysical concepts and what necessarily must be the case, and ground, obviously, ethics either, well, first by necessitation and then sufficiently from that point on in relation to a dialectic? They both love to have these kind of lofty throwbacks to this to this paradigm of ideology, and it's funny because they're both accusing each other of existing in separate paradigms. You know, one's saying like, look, you're or you know, like he's saying that you're a Christian and I'm an atheist, or they're both saying that Jordan's maybe going like they're both Christian, but ultimately they are both fundamentally looking through the same socio-historical narrative in the first place, which is obviously that's not a problem. It's not an argument against them. It's just to say that like it kind of shows like why they are looking through this reductionist lens. Just that I think it's almost ironic that that they're in this position. But I think that is what is important here is obviously what Jordan did say, which is the value of the individual, the value of the traditions themselves is separate from the tradition itself. And that is something that Gadamer, I think, shows really well. And I cannot stress this enough. Hans-Georg Gadamer, Truth and Method. Moi.
The golden rule is a good rule even for monkeys.
Yes, exactly. And so,
but let me just add to the
yeah.
picture you sketched out. I completely agree with. We have an ethical obligation even to our future selves, right? I mean, we are in relationship to who's going to be the person who's drinking his fourth scotch tonight has some ethical relationship to the person who's going to wake up with a hangover tomorrow morning, and one thing we know for sure, and which we have begun to dimly understand and describe scientifically, is that we are bad at all of these calculations.
Yes.
Right? Like the hyperbolic discounting of future rewards.
Well, that's also why I think we have these stringent limitations on rationality, Sam, is that we can't solve the problem through calculation.
Well, no, but
We can't solve it individualistically with caprice. Instead, we resolve to a system which is deontological and established in a form of law to benefit from the collective reasoning and deduction itself. And I would say that is the value of all institutions that are ethically established, whether they are atheist or religious. And we should see the value within them in relation to reason itself. Rather than obviously some sort of metaphysical presupposition in relation to whether it's a reductionist position or a religious one, religious presupposition.
we increasingly can, and even where it's best summarized not by one thing I'll grant you is that it's not always best conveyed or rendered indelible and actionable by being given a nature paper or an abstract from a paper in the literature and being told this is the way you want to behave to maximize your well-being. It may best be conveyed by certain stories, right, or certain books that are in the philosophy section of the bookstore, not the science section. And you and I were at the book signing the other night, and someone came up with a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, right? A fantastic book. I mean, there's so much wisdom in that book, right? And there's nothing about stoning a girl to death if she's not a virgin on her wedding day. Now, we all recognize that Marcus.
But obviously, understanding the socio-historical traditions in which we have been embedded in our culture and our laws and the way in which we approach one another and our ethical institutions is part and parcel of the fact of the philosophy of history, right? Like, we need to understand the foundations of these traditions in relation to why they've occurred, the reasons that existed within them, and then keep what is good. Just because it contains, obviously, you always get criticized. You always get the atheist that criticizes the rational Christian who says they cherry pick that which is good. Well, that's exactly what you should do, and that's what you should do with every ideology. Only take that which is good. Cherry picking the good is a fundamental way of discarding the bad. Okay, it allows the perpetuation of only that which is good. So it's inherently non-dogmatic. So why wouldn't you cherry pick the good? And why would you criticize those who are religious for cherry picking the good? Praise the religious thinker who cherry picks the rational, rather than instantiates a dogmatism and takes it to be true regardless of its evidenced position. Or it's the same thing with the atheist who has no ethical paradigm at all, because they reject 9 out of 10 traditions that have been perpetuated through our society. They lose an understanding of themselves. They lose an understanding of themselves in relation to others, and our institutions fall into crisis, which has been, which is unbelievably common today. We can see that an absolute skepticism of our institutions is unwarranted and dogmatic in and of itself, and an absolute acceptance of our institutions is dogmatic in and of itself.
Aurelius was a human being who wrote this book, and that provenance is no barrier to taking the book deadly seriously. It's an incredibly useful book, and Stoicism could be the, quote, religion or the guiding philosophy of the West. It would be a much better one than Judaism or Christianity.
I disagree, actually. I think Stoicism would be worse than Judaism or Christianity, well, especially Christianity. I think enlightened Christianity is by far better than Stoicism. Stoicism not only is just as abstract as Christianity in terms of its metaphysical foundation, but Hegel argues it's what leads to what's called the unhappy consciousness, in which the individual rejects, the value of their experiences within the world and seeks to, go towards a higher goal, which is ungrounded and instead is actually more a form of philosophical escapism. Go to the mental garden in your head rather than experience the life which is painful and difficult in the here and now. And that is something which is absolutely in relation to the very the power dynamics that existed in Rome. An understanding of that can show you an understanding of why we shouldn't be stoic. And I would say, yeah, like the enlightened Christian has a philosophical tradition which has benefited from Stoicism and perpetuated onwards from that point. Ooh, thank you. Thank you very much.
And have virtually none of the downside. And so that's my point, that we're in this perverse circumstance of being held hostage by certain products of literature, and we need to break the spell. And
none of the downsides. Well, that's not true. I mean, actually, they both share one of the downsides is the lofty abstractness, in which individuals can go into deliberately the cessation of all desire rather than just certain desires, which is an issue in general of of any abstract, non-earthly understanding of reality. And I think Stoicism's just as guilty of it as Christianity, if not more guilty of it than Christianity. So yeah.
And if we're finding it this hard to break, what do we think is going to happen in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, the moral progress we need to engineer is a common humanity coming together across shared values.
Those are perfectly credible arguments, but the weakness in the argument, I think, is the one that we started to talk about earlier, which is that when you talked with Dave Rubin a while back, and Michael Shermer said the same thing recently.
Cloud of Time, I just saw your message there, like you're in chat there. I'm very sorry, I've completely forgot what I was supposed to chat today. Did I say that we were going to chat today? We were going to have a conversation on Wednesday, which just started for you, your 8 hours Pacific time. Rather than do it that late, would a night chat be good for you, say around 8 p.m. your time? I can't remember arranging this. I'm not going to lie to you, Cloud of Time. I'm really sorry. I've just been super busy. I've got like messages from like quite a few people involved with conversations, so I've genuinely just lost place with that. So sorry, I'm not avoiding you. And I'm very apologetic of that. We can definitely have a chat another time.
He basically said that atheism is a doctrine of negation. That's what you said with Rubin, is that there isn't a positive ethos in atheism. All it says is that there's nothing personified. There's nothing personified transcendent. It's something like that. There is no God, and so the problem with the atheistic perspective,
it's not even the assertion that there is no God. It's just that it's a failure to be convinced by any of the gods on offer. It's just like not believing in Zeus.
Fine, and it's not like it's a weak. It's not like it's a weak argument. I mean, I'm perfectly aware that making a deistic case or a case for religion in the face of the claims of the rationalist atheists is perhaps, well, it's a very, very difficult thing to manage. But it is also the case that, and this is where I think we differ with regards to what happened, say, in the Soviet Union and perhaps to also in Nazi Germany, is that when your doctrine demolishes the let's call it the literary or fictional substructure and leaves nothing behind, an ethos needs to be provided, because something will rush in to fill the void. And it's certainly the case, and this is what Nietzsche warned about, even though he was a strident anti-Christian, and it's also what Dostoevsky foresaw. He said, if we knock out the logos from the substructure of Western society, Nietzsche believed that it was Christianity's emphasis on truth that destroyed Christianity, which was...
Yeah, that's exactly right, which led to the scientific paradigm being overvalued as an abstract and expression of the same aesthetic ideal.
Extremely interesting criticism, that Christianity had elevated to truth to such a degree that it actually resulted in the demolition of its own dogmatic substructure. But be that as it may, Nietzsche's prognostication was that if we allowed God to die, and perhaps there were reasons for that, that the consequence would be that we would be awash in both nihilism and totalitarian bloodshed, and that is what happened in the 20th century. And
there's another aspect to that, which is that you may try to knock out the whole thing and take out some of the substructure, but not the whole thing. That's what Nietzsche also shows. That his prediction, and I think it's blindingly obviously true, that you might, in this post-Christian era, have a remnant of Christianity such as guilt, overbearing guilt, and no means of alleviation or redemption.
Right, which is actually part of the problem of Protestantism, by the way, right. Because it's, and there are other things too that seem to be fundamental religious issues that secularists, I think, have a difficult time accounting for. It's like, so you actually have to grapple seriously with the problem that a doctrine that's essentially one of negation doesn't offer a positive ethos. And you are doing that, to be perfectly fair. You said that reading a Nature paper about the necessity of calculating your ethic across multiple timeframes and multiple persons doesn't have the motive force that's going to drive you to act ethically in life. And I do believe that's true, but I think the fact that the rationalist ethos doesn't have motivational push is actually a fatal flaw.
They don't mean
Well, I think that this is an issue. It's whether you're it's the difference between Kant and Hegel. If you are taking a purely rational understanding of reality, then you've lost reason anyway, which is another point of why you've lost the motivational force. The divorce between reason and desire is not something that can occur within a Hegelian system, because desire itself, in its sublimation and its understanding, in the way in which we try to achieve given ends, is rational in origin. It is about divesting reality in a certain way. We are, raised as animals without any understanding of reality at all, no inherent knowledge, and instead are indoctrinated into a conceptual schemata from which to understand ourselves and our relationship with the world. And so that fundamental relationship is the relationship psychoanalytically between the signification and reality, between the imagination and the signification and the imagination and reality. It is the mergence of humanity within the world that is. And they must take upon themselves the responsibility of the creation of the world just as much as it's the understanding of the world. That they themselves are part of a world which is being created for them, and they need to continue to perpetuate its creation. And that is in and of itself, I think, an understanding of reason and rationality which is motivating by its very nature. Because reason and rationality is in and of itself the only way that we can achieve any measurable expression of desire.
Meet every week to read Marcus Aurelius. That's a big problem.
And they don't write music. There's no music that goes along with it. There's no art that goes along with it. There's no architecture that goes along with it. And I don't know why exactly.
But to be fair to the present, most music and most art and most architecture is no longer religious. I mean, that it has flown the perch provided by religion traditionally. And most of what we care about in increasingly cosmopolitan and secular societies is not tied to religion in any direct way. And there are even whole religions like Judaism where you have to look long and hard to find anyone who believes much of anything that is religious. I have literally sat on stage debating what I thought was a religious rabbi who was a conservative rabbi, and when I said something that assumed that he believed in a God who could hear prayers, he threw up his hands and he said, "What makes you think I believe in a God who can hear prayers?" And I was just, I practically lost the debate just in my astonishment. It's like, what does it mean to be a conservative rabbi in this case? There are religions that have made that transition to an increasingly attenuated commitment to the truth of the doctrine, and there are religions who haven't moved an inch, right? And but I think we have to acknowledge that this movement in this direction is progress, because what it actually is at bottom is increasing sensitivity to the difference between having good reasons and bad reasons for what you believe, right? And the fact that this book has been around forever.
But then an understanding of one's socio-political environment understands the way that logic functions in the first place. And I think that Hegel does a great job in showing that logic itself is fundamentally contextual upon the thoughts which are being rationalized. And so a rejection of the concepts that exist within today will not allow for logic to perpetuate a system which is more true and more capable of expressing truth, but will actually do the opposite. It will force us to reevaluate and reconstitute the very thoughts from which logic would be capable of divesting reality. And this is why metaphysically the understanding of the way in which logic actually functions can never be differentiated from the thoughts that are being used within our argumentation. Logic is not only present in language, but is a factor and a formulation of language.
Is not a good reason. The fact that mommy
Well,
told me so.
it's actually, it's not a terrible reason though, because the fact that something has lasted for that length of time at least makes the fact that it's lasted a mystery. And you can't just attribute that to casual politicking or economic circumstances. There's something, look, the least that you can say about many of the biblical stories is that they're incredibly memorable. And that means that in some sense they're adapted to the memory structures of our minds.
So is the mythology of ancient Greece. It's incredibly memorable.
But I don't
and
disagree with that.
All those gods are dead. The stories still can be useful,
yeah,
but the gods are dead.
Their spirit lives on, let's say.
Yeah, but it lives on in a way that is benign. It lives on in a way where you learn about them in mythology class in school, right?
But I think the difference is whether they are I think that, don't get me wrong, I agree that that they are still functioning and still useful, but because they are representative of a way of life which is no longer applicable to the average everyday individual, what we learn is not approachable, and that's the issue. The fact that it's a religion from which nobody believes shows that it's a dead institution from which any technology that is developed from it ascribes an ideology which exists now onto an ideology which existed then, and ultimately perpetuates a variant technology. Don't get me wrong, it has value, but whether you could say that it is still useful is a bit of a jump, I would say. Then again, I think that there is a point to be made that you don't have to agree with the church. You don't have to agree with the Bible and the way that it's written in every way. You don't have to agree with all of the aspects of religion. And I did say, take the good and only take the good. The enlightened individual who is, whether it's just purely ethical or not, is abstracting the good aspects of Christianity in relation to how they live their life, is engaged in ethical community. And that is fundamentally where we derive our the genuinely instantiated norms and conventions, not individualistically in our belief systems and our understanding of reality in which we investigate, but in our conversations, in our relationships, in our institutions. That is where ethics is derived, and that is where the understanding of Christianity or an understanding of ancient Greek mythology is beneficial to conversation.
Right, you don't have a fear of Hades drummed into you as a child by your parents.
The other thing that is lacking, as far as I can tell, in the rationalist doctrine, and this is something that I've observed in my clinical practice, and so one of the things that's happened over the last year is that I've had many people, especially ex-soldiers, come to my lectures who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and they say that listening to my lectures, especially the ones on good, evil, and tragedy, there's a particular lecture that I suppose you might think about as devoted to people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, and that the language of good and evil that I lay out in those lectures is actually what allows them to recover from their post-traumatic stress disorder. And dealing with people like that in my clinical practice, the same thing has been the case. If we can't transcend the language of the merely rational and move into an intense conversation about good and evil in some senses, metaphysical realities, we can't enter a realm of seriousness, conceptual seriousness, that's of sufficient depth to help heal someone who's been touched by malevolence. Because that actually is what happens to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, is that inevitably the reason that they're so shattered isn't because something tragic has happened to them, although that does happen upon occasion. It's because someone malevolent has made contact with them, and sometimes that malevolent being, let's say, or malevolent force or spirit, for lack of a better word, is something that resides within them. And so we have these limits on rational, and the reason I'm making this case is because we've already identified another limit of rational discourse. It's like it doesn't have the motivating power of great fiction and great literature and great poetry, but it also doesn't have the healing power of language that takes the ethical realm to its extreme in some sense. And then the next problem with that, and this is something that Douglas has been contemplating, I would say, is that what evidence do we have that a merely secular representation, a rational representation of our ethic, is going to provide us with a motive force that would be sufficient for us to do such things as identify what's valuable about our culture and be motivated to sufficiently protect it, assuming that there's something worthy of protection.
But we know what a few of those things are, and they have nothing to do with what's on the inside of a church or a synagogue or a mosque. They have to do with things like free speech, right? Like the trench we are all fighting in.
Understanding the value of free speech is understanding the historical process which led to it in the first place, and the understanding of liberty and equality in relation to the development from Judeo-Christian values is important. But obviously I would say that, like, we don't want to fall into dogmatism either way. We don't want to say, like, we don't want to overly reject anything or overly accept anything, and just take our institutions as they are, but try to move them into what they should be is the fundamental responsibility of the individual ethically today.
It is, at least one of them, is defense of the free exchange of ideas. And that is put in peril by many kinds of orthodoxies, but some are the old orthodoxies, the blasphemy laws, and the people who want apostates to be killed for leaving, in this case, Islam. So those are some of the sacred. I would, if we were going to list the sacred artifacts of art that keep our society worth living in, I think the list is going to be very long before we start getting to the actual sacred objects of any one faith.
It's not about the sacred objects, it's about the ethical relationship between individuals, and the abstract ethical concepts that exist within Christianity are useful. Whether or not they are misguided and misled, depending upon the institution, is another thing. And an understanding of ethics as a whole doesn't necessarily require mysticism, don't get me wrong, but an understanding of the divinity that exists within man, I think, is unbelievably valuable in relation to how we approach reality, and understanding that each generation is moving towards an ethical, utopian understanding of itself and its relationship with others. And that's what we should be considering within our conceptual schemata.
It'll be things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and the free exchange of ideas across boundaries. The fact that we are no longer religiously or linguistically or geographically partitioned in the ideas we can entertain.
Well, it seems to me, though, like, and this may be my own idiosyncratic reading of the domain, but when I look at something like I've often considered a cathedral dome, let's say, and there are very, very old cathedral domes that have an image of Christ put up against the dome, right? So as creator of the cosmos, okay? And I'm trying to look at that from a psychological and even a biological perspective. And what I see is the elevation of a particular image that represents an ideal. And so the Christ that's represented on the dome of a cathedral is something that's projected up into celestial space. So it's an ideal to which you are supposed to be subordinate, or that you're supposed to embody. And the ideal is the ideal of the Logos, technically speaking. The Logos, the Word made flesh, which is not only the Word, free speech for lack of a better term, but also the embodiment of that, elevated to the highest principle. And that is given status as the creator of the universe. And the reason for that, in part, and this is written into the Judeo-Christian doctrine, right?
It's the creation. I actually very much like this interpretation. It's definitely very, very niche.
From line 1 is the idea that it's through the discourse that you value so much that we actually engender the world as such. And that is that
I would like to point out, that makes religion and religious believers fundamentally subordinate to reason and language. And so the interpretation of the Bible is dependent upon the understanding of concepts, which means that the fundamentalist position must be rejected in this worldview, because the God could never command something irrational, or an understanding of reason as being the foundation of the concept of good, which is expressed within the abstract, which is only personified and signified within the Bible, means that the Bible can be judged as being an expression of a culturally politically understood notion of good rather than goodness itself. and it's a rejection of like a fundamentalist position, I would say.
Divine principle, and it's also, in my reading, the divine image of God that men and women are made in. And so what I see in the underlying metaphysic, where you see superstition and fundamentalism, and look, fair enough, and it's not like I would ever argue that that's not a danger. I see the imagistic and dramatized representation of exactly the idea that you hold to be paramount above all else, which is your commitment to truth, expressed in speech.
Okay, well, my concern, and this is where I started with you, is that you could give the same charitable reading of astrology, and you'd even be tempted to do it as we talk about astrology, as you showed at the outset. Now,
but I don't think why is it a charitable reading, Sam? Like,
well, no, I mean,
so how else would you explain the existence of something like a cathedral with that image? Like, what the hell were people doing when they built that?
I'm saying we could. It's by dint of mere historical contingency and.
Well, I think that's not necessarily the case. I think that exists, like, if you're talking about the existence of logos, then obviously all institutions contain within them an aspect of rationality. To what degree they are rational is essentially the fundamental precept from which whether we should reject or accept them.
Questionable luck that we're not living in a world where the cathedrals have stained glass windows with signs of the zodiac on them. Right, we could be in that world.
Well, we are. We
were very close to being in that world.
We are in that world to some degree because the astrological endeavor in the Judeo-Christian landscape expanded to incorporate Christianity. And there's an entire astrology of Christianity, including representation of Christ as the sun. So we are in that world.
So my point is that we recognize that the literal claims of astrology, the mechanism by which astrologers think it works, is intellectually bankrupt.
Yeah, but the same with all like spiritual endeavors. Any literal interpretation of a spiritual scripture is intellectually bankrupt.
Right, and if any significant mayhem were being caused by people's commitment to astrology, if we had presidents of the United States who couldn't get elected unless they paid lip service to a literal belief in astrology, if we had presidents who were consulting...
Yeah, but that has more to do with the historical predomination of Christianity and the establishment of the United States. Like, look, the United States was built on those individuals who fled the Enlightenment. Many of the individuals who moved to the United States, which is why fundamentalism is so popular over there, was built on like the movement of Puritans and the movement of those individuals who sought to escape the Enlightenment and reason and wanted to establish dogmatism in a new nation. Thank you for your donation, Cloud of Time.
Cloud of Time donated £5. Here's some support. I get that you're busy. I mostly have questions for you for clarity on your positions. Chat doesn't cut it. If you have time soon, I would appreciate it. Sorry for muddying up the chat. That will...
Yeah, that's no problem, man. I just appreciate the donation, and obviously we can definitely have time for a chat, like 100%. I'm very sorry that I let you down today. I let Evan Soy down as well yesterday. I keep muddling up what days I'm doing what, and I just need to use my calendar more efficiently, to be entirely honest with you. But I really appreciate the donation. Yeah, very much so. And yeah, like I think I was just saying in relation to actually I can't remember what the hell I was saying. That's just totally gone. No, it's I think I made my point anyway.
Consulting their astrologers to figure out when to meet with other world leaders.
Oh, the lip service that the have to play to fundamental Christianity is unfortunately a byproduct of the foundation of the United States and the continuation of that tradition, which needs to be internally and externally critiqued, but primarily internally critiqued. Have an education system that teaches philosophy. That'd be a really great idea.
Right. This would be a problem that rational people would recognize. I mean, astrology can be disproven in a single hour. You just simply have to go to one hospital in one city sometime and find two unrelated children born in within 20 feet of each other, and follow their lives. And if they have different lives, then the signs of the zodiac mean nothing.
Part of your argument is, and validly so.
I mean, that is an incredibly empirical way of having to disprove. You couldn't just conceptually disprove the fundamental tenets of the zodiac and just show that there is no genuine foundation from why you should believe an individual be dictated by cosmological events, like the life of the individual be dictated by cosmological events, or the character and the disposition of the individual. You couldn't just do that rationally. Why has it got to be empirical? Why has it got to be, again, in relation to something which actually occurs rather than something which must be occur? Why couldn't it just be done through a priori, like through, I was going to say a priori synthetic. Why couldn't it just be to do with the conceptual endeavor and hermeneutic rather than empirical? I don't understand why it's always got to be empirical.
How in the world do we determine which revelatory axioms are worthy of respect and of maintenance? And fair enough, Sam.
But maybe none. Maybe not revelatory. Maybe it is just a matter of conscious agents like ourselves having better and better conversations.
Well, it is certainly partly that. But let me explain.
Because again, revelation in my book is nothing other than the record of past conversations. So you've either got Iron Age conversations shaping your worldview, or you have conversations like these shaping your worldview.
Or you have both.
Yeah, or you have both, and I think that is fundamentally like understanding one's his socio-historical position. You know, there's that famous expression, if you don't learn history, then you're doomed to repeat it. I think that is tantamount to the value of our institutions and the value of our traditions. Like, why did those institutions develop? Why did those traditions develop? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Why did the people in the Iron Age think this? Why did the people in the in the medieval era think this? And understanding the way in which our reasons and rationality develops, it allows us to understand from a philosophical grounding, a dialectical grounding, the historical process of reason itself and self-consciousness. And this is why I think, just grounding in upon the conversations we have now is valueless, because the only thing that separates us from someone in the Iron Age is ideology. The conversations that we have now are tantamount in terms of value and conceptually laden value upon the rationality and the development of reason of those conversations that have proceeded from generation to generation. And so to understand the institutions which have housed those conversations, and to understand those conversations themselves and the life of the individuals that existed back then, and the philosophy of history of this whole process, is to understand oneself in the first place. And without that, then we could fall into the same conceptual errors that they themselves managed to overcome 1,000 years ago.
You can have both,
but
then you have a dialogue with the past.
But which brings me to Marcus Aurelius. I read him with great pleasure and astonishment, frankly. I mean, it is such a modern and edifying take on ethics and one's own personal well-being, and just not being encumbered by thoughts and vanities that are so easy to cut through once you notice them, but so captivating and deranging of your life when you don't. And there's more wisdom in that book than almost any book I can name, and you don't have to believe any bullshit to honor it and use it.
Let me offer you a continued explication here. You didn't answer my question about what all these crazy medieval people were doing, spending almost all of their excess capital building a representation of the sky and putting an image on that. So just hang on a sec. Okay. So let's talk about what it would mean to embody the truth.
Let's speed this up.
So there's a deep idea in Christianity that this is what it would mean. It would mean to confront the suffering of life voluntarily to its fullest, which would mean to accept the necessity of death and betrayal at the hands of your fellow men without undue bitterness. To accept that voluntarily and to still understand that your fundamental ethical task is to work towards the redemption of the world. And that's associated with that image that's cast upon the heavenly dome. And that isn't a charitable reading, Sam. That's an essential analysis of the fundamental doctrines of...
I would agree with that. I don't think that you can divorce Christianity from the understanding that one's ethic, from its ethic. But I also think that there is obviously the abstract or that worldly ethic that it embodies. This idea that you will be born in the world hereafter is the motivation of the individual to perpetuate an ethical life, rather than understanding that heaven and hell are actually experiences of individuals in the world today.
of Christianity.
Yes, but I could do the same thing with Buddhism and give you a slightly different story, but nonetheless inspiring and edifying. And I could do the same thing with.
Yeah, but you can't do it with rationality.
But I can do it with Greek. No, that's not true. I can do it with Greek mythology. I can do it with any of these domains. But the crucial bit for me is that in order to make use of those stories, I don't have to believe in Revelation. I don't have to believe that you get everything you want after you die.
I'm not sure Jordan's suggesting that you
No, but I'm talking about the applause of conventionally religious people who think that their conventional religion.
That's just kind of, again, bullshit, right? Like, don't get me wrong, I agree with what he's saying, like, in terms of, like, you don't necessarily need some sort of divine revelation to gain any sort of truth from the matter. But then, obviously, conflating the applause, which from Jordan's position has been, on the perpetuation of logos, the position of reason, with those who are fundamentalist Christians or Christians who believe in a very abstract, otherworldly notion of right without any sort of philosophical defense, is a bit questioned. But it's a bit poisoning. Sorry, it's a bit presumptuous.
In some way, cashed out or redeemed or supported by the reading you're giving now of Christ in the starry heavens. It's not, unless you're adding this other piece, which is some probabilistic claim that, yes, this book probably was dictated by an omniscient being, unlike any other book.
Well,
or maybe the Muslims are right, that Archangel
not...
Gabriel did show up to Muhammad in his cave and give him the one final revelation, never to be superseded. And just on the merits of the text, we know that's not true. We know, but for all it gets wrong and all it fails to get right about the nature of our circumstance, we know that book is not the best book ever written on any topic. And here I'm speaking of the...
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Like, obviously, fundamentalist readings of any religion is just dogmatic and intellectually bankrupt, as he says. But it's probably a necessary step of most cultures to overcome.
The Quran, but it's true of the Bible. It's true of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. But no one's claiming that about the Meditations, and that's a crucial difference. It's a difference that explains so much unnecessary suffering.
But then you would reject that interpretation in fundamentalism, not necessarily the work itself and the tradition and the institutions which exist around it, which especially in, for example, Catholicism, I know that I can speak in somewhat authority on that, and know that the way that it's spoken about in terms of in church even, and like Roman Catholic communities, is very metaphorical. It's supposed to represent something, not a literal interpretation of these actions and behaviors. And that is, I think, more true of the priest who speaks of it than usually the religious follower, though. But that's an issue of dogmatism and an issue of the authoritarianism of the church in the years before. So, yeah.
In our world. And again, what I fear about the way you talk about religion is that at the end of all these conversations, I'm still not sure what you believe on that point, frankly. And if I'm not sure, no one out there is.
Well, I don't know why you would expect to be sure about what someone believes. How do you think that any one of you are capable of fully articulating what you believe? You certainly aren't. You are not. That's completely ridiculous. You're not transparent to yourself by any stretch of the imagination. Well, you act out all sorts of things that you can't articulate.
But how about a best guess? Yeah.
If you look, let's go all cognitive neuroscience on this, shall we? 99% of your processing is unconscious. You're not capable of articulating yourselves. If you were, you'd be omniscient. Okay, don't give me any nonsense about that.
But that is a... I've never heard so many people applaud an evasion of a simple question.
It was a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Honestly, yes, everything you just said about not being fully transparent to yourself is true, and you are ruled by committee in there all the time, no doubt. But I'm asking what you actually believe. I mean, there's several things I can ask. I can ask almost any one.
But like even like I would say like even the understanding that the like in the Lacanian sense that the individual, that the unconscious is structured like a language, is vitally important to this. It's like understanding obviously the language which structures you is a fundamental aspect of this.
One of these threads can pull the whole tapestry. But to take Christianity as an example, what do you believe about the origin of this sacred book, the Bible, Old and New Testament? Do you believe that just maybe it has a status unlike any other book, or is it simply old writing of human beings just like ourselves?
I think it's both.
Okay, so but so what does that mean? You're saying that there's somebody who's taking dictation that is unlike any other dictation. So Homer though
Sam,
creative,
it's not
or
like
Shakespeare,
it's
though
not
creative,
like we
was doing
understand
something
the
else.
sources of inspiration.
Okay,
if you
but
talk to
everyone's been
creative people,
inspired.
if you talk to creative people,
Yes,
they
okay,
say
so-
they often describe themselves as something approximating a conduit through which higher wisdom is pouring.
Again, you're dodging. Shakespeare could say that, and,
Yes.
and any writer can say that, ultimately,
Yes,
right?
and it's also the case that we would rank order those writers, which is why you pointed to Shakespeare, in terms of the generalizable validity of their revelations.
Sure.
And so, well, look, so you run into the same issue. You criticize the Bible, and look, fair enough. But you're also evading a very important issue, which is how do you quantitatively rank the contributions of literature without assuming that there's a hierarchy of revelation?
There's a hierarchy of wisdom, sure. There's a
Is it revelation? Like, would you say that it's revelation? I mean, it's the movement to that which is noble. I mean, if we talk about that, and revelation being a rational process, perhaps, but revelation in terms of, the purely creative aspect of the individual loses, obviously, its force. But I don't think Peterson's necessarily saying that, because he did say before that the imaginative process must be grounded with the rational process in the first place, in a sense of community, which I would agree. Whether I would call that revelation, I think depends upon how we define revelation and our understanding of it. So you might very well be justifying a form of revelation that, for example, that I think that many people in the audience may very well be clapping at, which is that you gain some sort of understanding of the Bible through the grace of God himself, in a literal sense, that the Bible establishes the words of God, and that establishes a meaning which transcends the inadequacies of our language, which is very dangerous and can be used to justify next to anything. So it depends on how we talk about revelation and the importance of its rational grounding.
hierarchy of human wisdom. I will grant you that every day of the week. But we're talking about primates like ourselves having conversations. And this is the most important game we can play. I mean, this is the best game in town, and it has always been so. But people are imagining, and it includes, as you said at the outset, what I would call spiritual experience. And spiritual experience admits of a fact-based discussion about the nature of human consciousness. And
why do you allow that as an exception?
Because it's not an exception; it's part of the data set. So it's possible to have
so this is spiritual experience without the possibility of concretized revelation. No. So it's a formless spirituality that you're advocating.
No, you can have. I'm not even discounting the possibility that there are invisible entities out there in the universe far smarter than ourselves who we could possibly be in dialogue with. I mean, there are many strange ideas that we could defend to one another degree. There are people walking around speculating that we might be living in a computer simulation, that all of this is being run on some hard drive of the future, or some alien supercomputer. Now, that you can actually, I mean, Nick Bostrom at Oxford gives a very cogent argument in defense of that thesis. Right now, you can deal with that on its merits. I'm not saying the universe isn't stranger than we suppose or even can suppose, but one thing we know is that when you read the Bible, you can turn every page of that book, and you will not find evidence of omniscience. You will not find anything in there that someone as smart as Shakespeare, or actually a little bit dumber, could have written.
No, right? I don't think that's true, Sam. There are incredibly whatever else you might say about the biblical writings, there are incredibly potent narratives embedded within them. It's impossible to write something, virtually impossible to write something like Cain and Abel. It's a paragraph long.
So you're saying the Shakespeare of 3,000 years ago couldn't have written Genesis?
He couldn't have written Cain and Abel, not in 10 sentences.
So then
Cain and Abel is 10 sentences long.
So then
it contains more wisdom than you can dig out in a lifetime.
So now we're getting to the nub of it. Then you think that was not the product of a human mind?
I think it was the product of a vast collection of human minds working over millennia.
Okay, so we have a committee of Shakespeare's. But still, we're dealing with people. We've just got people.
But I think that's where me and Peterson would agree there, that it's the editing, the constant. It is the institution itself that is creating the divinity of man, not a single man. It is the universal, and that is what is being reflected in God, which is, I think, a nice interpretation, but obviously not anything necessarily related to the way in which people instantiate God.
But this concession, if indeed you're making it, and I'm still not sure, is the eradication of traditional Christianity.
Look, if something is deeply wise, it's reflective of a deeper reality.
Is it the eradication of Christianity, or is it the interpretation of Christianity in a different way? The interpretation of Christianity as it is an ethical institution. It's the interpretation, it's the rejection of fundamentalism, to be sure, but it's not the rejection of, like, many of the fundamental precepts, which is, the divine, an understanding of a transcendent divine, which exists within us as a form of spirit, that exists within Jesus as in a representation of what we could be, and exists within a God as being the abstract authority of justice itself. And so all of these are essentially, I think, very much connected to Greek thought in some respects in terms of logos, but and I think as Peterson said, but is a way of understanding reality which was written deliberately into the texts. It was written into the texts, and it's also written into the institutions which have been evaluating the texts, and even our ethical institutions which have led to our ethical institutions today, and even the way that we think, the very words we use.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be wise.
I'm in love with deeper reality.
So what's the deeper reality that something as wise as the story of Cain and Abel reflects? What's the reality?
A landscape of mind that we are, that either takes great training, great luck, or pharmacological bombardment of the human brain to explore. Right? There are ways to get there. There are ways to have the beatific vision. Right? And we understand this to some degree experientially, and we can understand it to some degree by third-person methods of science. And it's not like I don't know.
But it's whether science would achieve, like, because science, especially in its current form, is empiricist in nature and reductionist atypically. Not all forms of science and not all scientific paradigms. Theoretical physics perhaps being an exception as well. But the way in which it understands reality is only one competing institution, and all are capable of producing measures of truth in relation to dialogue. And it doesn't mean that we need to reject one or the other. It means we need to be rational about those institutions themselves.
I've had many experiences that, if I had them in a religious context, would have counted for me as evidence of the truth of my religion, right? But because I was not brought up in a religious context, and because I
just got sort of in chat, it said virtually impossible to write Cain and Abel. Yeah, like I think he's saying that individualistically, that the story itself is wise beyond the measure of any given individual that occurred throughout history. It is the collective wisdom of individuals refining a story in terms of a mythology. And that is true of all forms of mythology, I would argue, not just the Christian one.
I spend a lot of time seeing the downside of that form of credulity. I have never been tempted to interpret these experiences that way.
Try a higher dose.
Yeah, believe me. Yes, I'll go. I'll play that game of poker with you all day long.
You'd be surprised,
yes,
my friend.
Yes. Well, maybe there's our next podcast.
Yeah.
Did you just see a card?
Look, I've got to ask all of you a question now. So we're an hour and 15 minutes into this discussion, and hypothetically, what we will do is stop and go to Q&A. But our experience so far has been that when we ask the audience, because we have done that each time, whether we've asked the audience whether we should continue or whether we should go to Q&A. So the first thing I'm going to do, and you can vote on this by making a certain amount of noise if you're inclined to do so. How many of you would like us to stop talking and go to Q&A? How many of you would like us to continue this discussion for 45 more minutes? It seems to me that it's an objective fact that the latter people have the floor.
It really is going to be a rude awakening when those applause are reversed, however.
Yeah, we know it's time to stop.
Just get off the stage.
Yeah. Okay, so let me. Douglas, you were going to say something.
What was ask something?
Was I going to ask something?
Yeah.
Yes.
I forgot what I was
Okay,
going
well,
to ask.
I'll ask you something. Let's go back to one of the core problems that we've been trying to address, which is the apparent failure, perhaps, of the rationalist atheist types to develop an active ethos that
is this way easier to watch now. It's 1.5 speed. I should have put this on 1.5 speed from the start. I don't know why I was watching this in normal speed. I feel like I've just been condemning myself to the slowest conversation in human history.
Has sufficient beauty and motivational power to serve as a credible replacement for the religious rituals.
Sorry, everyone.
So there must be a reason why that failure has occurred.
Yeah.
Right? So, do you have any sense of what the reason might be?
I can give you a short list of reasons. One is that traditionally the impulse to do that in a religious context has been fatal. Right? So to declare your apostasy has been the almost as reliable a way of committing suicide as jumping off a building in most cultures and most societies for the longest time, and still is in many places, as you know, in the Muslim world. So there's been a barrier to entry to thinking creatively about alternatives to religion. And so much of atheism and secularism is just a pitched battle against the eroding power of religion. I mean, when religion really has its power, right? We know what it's like. I mean, again, I think we spoke about this at one point. The moment that it makes this most salient is Galileo being shown the instrument of torture by men who wouldn't look through his telescope. Right? I mean, that was the point of contact between untrammeled human rationality and the womb that bore it. Right? The religious awe at the beauty of the heavens. Right? So the moment a person like Galileo stepped a little too far, and to connect us to astrology again, Galileo was a court astrologer. Right? There was a point of contact between astronomy and astrology at that point. So we're still under the shadow of that kind of dogmatism and oppression in much of the world. I mean, for the longest time, I mean, it's still in the
True.
United States, you cannot run for the presidency without pretending to believe in God. It's amazing. It's an amazing fact, right? When will that change? Someday it will, but we have just had almost no time to experiment in this space.
But it's like it's whether you do believe in a God in terms of an abstract divinity within man. It depends on what we mean by God, and you know, I would say I would appreciate that everyone who is you know, truly ethical in the sense of like understanding an abstract right believes in an abstract spirit in one way or another, and that's a very Hegelian concept, but that exists in the humanity in which perpetuates ethics. It exists between us. It is the spirit which guides us towards, you know, onwards. It is it is the expression of reason and justice within our institutions. It is what connects us and our joint humanity. It is us fundamentally. And that, I hope, doesn't die out. But that the rejection of religion simpliciter could lead to that. And I think it has in many cases, just as much as the religious dogmatism has taken hold, the, you know, anti-religious dogmatism takes hold, and we get people trying to justify subjective, individualistic understandings of reality, which are used to justify just as much harm as the dogmatic religious views. And this is, you know, tantamount to the fact that we genuinely just need reason above all else to guide our imaginative and our imaginative and investigative processes. We need reason itself.
And innovate.
Well, there's been some time. There's been some decades. And I suppose the thing that unites Jordan and me on this is...
Oh, thank you for your donation, O'Neill. I really appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the channel.
Face some of the problems, some of
If you have anything to say, just drop it in chat, man.
the enemies, you might even say, that you identify as well. And the question is whether you should face them in the midst of an experiment that may or may not work, i.e. a leap into pure rationality, or whether you might decide it's worth, among other things, taking some of the versions of things that you've had that have been of worth in your past and using them where they're useful.
But what are you picturing there? Because there really is no leap. There's no global leap to pure rationality. There's this incremental erosion of religious answers to terrestrial questions. So there's again, the moment you have a science of neurology, you begin to look at epilepsy not as demonic possession, but as a neurological problem. Before there's a science of neurology, you don't know what the hell's happening, right? So into that space...
Something obviously drove Douglas, I would say, in some sense, surprisingly, to make the assumption that one of the things that we need to do to defend whatever it is that we have of value in the West, assuming that we have anything of value, was something like the reincorporation of this religious substructure. So it's not something that I would have expected you to conclude.
But what
so why did you conclude it?
Well, partly for the reason I just suggested, that the leap into pure rationality, there's no evidence yet that it's going to work, or it's going to be enough, or enough people are going to be able to partake in it.
But give me the precise place where you're worried that it's going to fail, and what are you imagining
Well, you
doing?
think it's failing now?
Yeah, let me give you one example. Yeah.
It depends on what we mean by pure rationality, and I think if we mean pure reason in the pure reason in the Kantian sense, I think we've already shown that it fails. But if we mean rationality and reason as it is, as it should be, as it must be, what is truly rational, which exists between individuals, then we are forced into a paradigm which is ethical, not necessarily spiritual in origin, in terms of mystical in origin. I don't think we necessarily need that. We can demythologize religion, and I certainly hope we do. But what I would say is it must exist within the ethics of our institutions. And I think that the movement towards a rational, ethical society which understands the value of individuals to be an end in themselves and our duties and obligations in relation to the expression of that end is, and you know, subjectivity and freedom is the good society. It is the society that it is the society that is the kingdom of heaven, you know, the kingdom of ends in the Kantian sense. But that's only possible if we, you know, in the words of Hegel, establish the loftiness of Kant into an earthly here and now.
I mean, we may be in the midst of the discovery that the only thing worse than religion is its absence.
And where are we discovering that?
Look at the religions that people are making up as we speak. I mean, every day there's a new dogma, and you and I and Jordan have repeatedly tripped over those dogmas. Some do usually survived, it has to be said, but they're stampeding to create new religion all the time at the moment. Every new heresy that's invented. and they're not as well thought through as past heresies. They don't always have the bloody repercussions yet, but you can easily foresee a situation in which they do. I mean, a new religion is being created as we speak by a new generation of people who think they are non-ideological, who think they're very rational, who think they're past myth, who think they're past story, who think they're better than any of their ancestors and have never bothered to even study their ancestors.
Right. So, but can't you say that dogmatism is the problem? The generic problem here is dogmatism, a firm belief in the absence of good argument and good evidence.
And absolutely, we can agree that dogmatism of any kind has that danger, or will always have that danger. But the void also has a danger. The void that you can create if you throw out all the stories that helped get you to where you are also has this danger.
Yeah, the void is a form of dogmatism. It is the skeptical, negative, empowered above the positive without rational foundation. It's something that rejects its own normativity, and which is why nihilism is ultimately self-defeating and ultimately such a danger, because it is at least as dangerous as any structure within reality, any other normative structure in reality, any other ethical structure, because it can justify genuinely anything and everything. It's an emptiness from which there is no escape, unless we are willing to remove ourselves from it, unless we are willing to build structures of meaning and engage in reality to seek truth.
Because people come up with these new stories. And every day's news now is about this. Our politics is now basically about this. Actually.
Yeah, and what's flown in to fill the gap seems to be something like a new tribalism.
Absolutely.
Which is exactly what you'd expect in some sense, right? If you demolish the superordinate system, religion divides people, no doubt, but it also unites people.
Yes.
And so one of the things that arguably unites people above their mere tribalism is their union in an abstract religious superstructure. Yeah. And then if you demolish that, well then one of the things that does seem to happen is the emergence of a reflexive tribalism, because people need a group identity of.
Yeah, that is actually a good point, that like obviously our institutions not only house our concepts, but house our concepts of self and our identities from which unify us. And so if we lose our communities alongside our the rejection of the institutions, like on the dogmatism within the institutions, then we lose reason itself.
Of sorts. And the easiest thing to do seems to be to revert to ethnicity and race and gender and sex, etc., etc. And then we do end up, and have ended up.
Remy, I think you're right in saying that it doesn't justify, that the void doesn't justify anything, but in as much of its lack of justification, it doesn't. It loses the negative force of skepticism around whether an individual would be justified in taking an action, which is why you have, individuals in society which use a postmodernist position to justify brutal acts of hatred and malice, or they use a rejection of given meta narratives as the same justification, as a removal of or an instantiation of only their desires and only their conceptions of reality matter, and then you have the presuppositionalist understandings in which people are, radically trying to heroically, quote unquote, establish a new paradigm. And so we have basically a movement back to Stone Age ethics, Stone Age morality, only enacted by 21st century conceptual agents.
In this situation that Douglas outlines. And, one of the things I think that distinguishes us temperamentally, possibly, maybe because you're a little more on the liberal side and I'm a little more on the conservative side, even temperamentally speaking, is that your fundamental terror is that of fundamentalism, although you also state in the moral landscape that you understand the perils of nihilism. And I would say my fundamental terror is that of nihilism, even though I'm sensitive to the catastrophes of fundamentalism. But I don't think you do address the problem of the void sufficiently. Because I don't think that you have anything to offer except, and I'm not trying to minimize your offering. You make a case that people should work to alleviate suffering and that we should live in truth, but Jesus, Sam, you can summarize that in 2 sentences. It doesn't have the potency of the fictional, literary, artistic substructure that seems necessary to make that into something that's a compelling story.
It's not just the potency, it's actually the concepts involved within it, and it's not necessarily the fiction that's the important part. It is what is housed within the fiction.
So this is where we might disagree. This could be a fundamental disagreement. Because I don't see the problem of nihilism the way you do, or the way it's advertised. Once you rip out the false certainties and the bad evidence and the bad arguments and the mere dogmas imposed on us by prior generations, that hole never closes safely with anything else. You have to put something in its place that's shaped just like that, some other false certainty or some other story. And I simply don't think that's the case. I think there's so many things we outgrow, both individually, in our own childhoods, and culturally, that where there is no void left. There's no Santa Claus-shaped void that we have to fill with the exact same thing.
But people certainly experience that.
Some people,
void.
I'm not discounting the fact that it is hard to be happy in this world. I mean, we are living in a world that seems perfectly designed to frustrate our efforts to find permanent happiness.
So you asked me, you put me on the spot a while back.
Let me just add my answer to this. I just think there's the recipe for a good life, or at least a minimal recipe for a good life. It's not that this is all that's entailed, but this is certainly necessary, if not sufficient, is to live a life that is increasingly motivated by love and guided by reason.
But I think that look, I mean that presumes an understanding of reality in itself. Like, why do we value love? Why are we valuing reason? What normative process are we allowing to shape and confine our worldviews in this sense, which is the real threat of nihilism, that we lose the ideology which is giving meaning to the structures of value around us. That is what nihilism actually is. The loss of nihilism actually is the loss of value. It's not just the loss of a given explanation of reality, it's the loss of reality itself, and almost a dissolution of self into that.
Right? You can't go very far wrong if you are motivated by love and guided by reason. Right? And the problem is that...
Well, okay. Well, the first thing I would say about that is, to me, that's a recapitulation of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which is that you should be guided by love and use logos to serve that.
Except you got to read the fine print on reason.
No, well, I didn't say reason. I said logos, because that's something that's deeper than reason.
There's the Jesus smuggling.
Yes, exactly. Well, yes, definitely. Okay, so look, I've been trying to. Part of the reason that I'm doing.
I don't think that's Jesus smuggling. That's like obviously like a spirit smuggling almost, and that's not necessarily like a notion of like Jesus Christ. I mean, this can all be symbolic and metaphorical anyway.
What I'm doing is to try to address the void, let's say, and I suspect that many of you are actually here because you would like to have the void addressed. And so the way it looks to me is something like this, and this is what I've derived in part from my studies of religious tradition. So I could say that at the beginning of Genesis, for example, there's a proposition that it's truthful speech that generates habitable order from chaotic potential. That seems to me to be the fundamental narrative, and I do believe there's something dead accurate and real about that, because we do generate the world as a consequence of our communicative effort. And then there's a second proposition, which is that the world that we generate from the chaos of potential is habitable to the degree that the communication that we engage in is truthful. And that's why God, who uses the logos at the beginning of time to generate the world, is able to say that his creation is good. The proposition is the world you bring into being through truthful speech is good. And that's the image of God that's implanted in man and woman. And there's a grandeur about that idea. And you think, well, you don't need the grandeur because it's just a fiction. It's like, just wait a second here. It's not just a fiction, unless you don't believe that in some manner you partake in the creation of the world and that you have an ultimate responsibility that might well...
There is, I think he's absolutely right. And this is actually present in, non-Abrahamic religions as well. This is present in... for example, the Greeks, this idea of order, Parmenides referencing the goddess Nyx in relation to the divine order of the universe, and this instantiation of logos being fundamentally integral to the way being exists and being itself. And so we can demythologize this and talking about being and non-being in relation to a Hegelian dialectic, for example.
All be described as divine to participate in that process properly, truthfully, and with love. And there's every reason to think that that's an elevated ideal so high that it's worthy of conceptualizing as divine, and also to presume that it represents some fundamental metaphysical reality. And that's a lot more powerful than you need to be good.
Yes, but the problem here, Jordan, is that I could do exactly what you just did with Buddhism or Hinduism. And it is just as grand and just as deep and just as anchored to the first-person experience of contemplatives who've taken that as far as they could take it.
Well, then I would say, Sam, you should do that and see how people respond to it.
Well, no, because I...
Yes, seriously.
No, because I see the end of the game. It doesn't arrive where I want to get to, where we need to get to, because it would be to different effect. They're different claims, ultimately, about the status of truth and good and evil, and about the beginning of the world and the fate of a human consciousness after death. It's completely...
Which is why, obviously, Hegel sees the end of all this being in philosophy. It is the philosopher who engages in who engages the abstract here and the abstract divine and the here and now into a universal understanding of reality and an ideology. And that's the job of the philosopher, to engage with these concepts and understand reality as it is and how it should be, which is why I would tell everyone, do some philosophy, man.
Completely irreconcilable worldviews.
I also don't think
that swear. If there are Hindus in the audience, they believe something that is totally irreconcilable to what Christians believe.
I don't think that you can offer, a watered-down version of Buddhism as a consequence of psychedelic experience as a acceptable and credible alternative to the power of the fundamental founding myths of the Western culture. And if you think you can, then you should try.
I'm trying. Well, I'm not trying that, but that's not what I... Well, first of all, just to get my biography straight, it's not just the psychedelic experience.
I know. And I'm also not making light of the psychedelic experience.
Listen, to take this... We're having most of this conversation on the side of wherein it seems reasonable to worry about the fate of civilization, right? We could have started at a very different point with just the nature of consciousness, right? Just our first-person encounter with being itself, right? All of us wake up each morning. We are thrust.
But we are doing that with language which is loaded and conceptualized from our institutions and our understanding of reality, which we cannot be divorced away from. So our understanding of self is ideologically confined by the self which exists today, which is why we talk about, that's why you have people like Slavoj Žižek talking about the divine objects of ideology. It is that I. It's the same with Lacan. It is the I that cannot see itself. We require the other. We require both external and internal critique towards understanding reality. And That's why Buddhism and engaging in a discourse between Eastern and Western philosophy will be very useful in terms of metaphysically divesting the positive and negatives of both traditions, if we could even get them to speak and engage in the same within a joined language.
Trust from a condition of deep sleep, which we seem to know nothing about, and we just got pushed through a veil of dreams into this apparently solid reality that we call the world, and we're engaging one another in this space of just consciousness and its contents, and we're trying to make sense of it. And science is the best language game we play, I would argue, in trying to make truly rigorous sense of it. But it doesn't exhaust all the language games we play. We play others that are also fact-based. We talk about what happened historically before we arrived here. We talk about facts as we can understand them that we just didn't witness, but others did, and we call that journalism, right? So we're trying to have a fact-based
We used to call
discussion.
that journalism.
Yes, it's getting harder and harder to discern what's actually going on now. But we are thrust into this condition of being our apparent selves moment by moment, and we notice the difference between happiness and suffering, right? And this is not merely sensory. It's not merely that, I don't like the feeling of a hot stove and I do like a warm bath. It's ideas. The ways of thinking about ourselves and the world can open the door or close the door to various states of happiness and suffering. And religion leverages that. People, the difference between believing that your dead child is in heaven with Jesus and not being able to believe that is enormous, right?
I want to ask a specific though. You've expended a certain amount of reputational energy and much more on the jihadists. In your battles, shall we say there, how much allyship, to use a very voguish term, have you found from fellow secular, rational people who want to love and reason like you?
Well, that is a leading question, isn't it?
I've got fingers if you need more.
No, your fingers are safe. No, unfortunately, but this is a problem of, I wouldn't ascribe this to, well, the allies you can easily find among deeply religious Christians, say, are there for the wrong reasons, right? So I can find, I
Well, not, are there wrong reasons for that?
Well, no,
wrong reasons.
They're there for the wrong. Well, they see the problem clearly for the wrong reasons. So, for instance, I meet secular scientist types, anthropologists, say, who are so far.
It's kind of like the difference between the right wing and the left wing in the United States, and I mean right and left very tentatively. The Democrats and the Republicans, they're both wrong for exactly the reasons that they're telling each other that they're wrong, but they're incapable of seeing each other in the light of the other community, and so establish themselves as right, regardless of a theory which is disproving their current hypothesis. And so they're not willing to actually communicate, and so it's incommensurable, and this incommensurability prevents any actual discourse to overcome the problems, and so it's a form of dogmatism that constantly perpetuates itself, and which is why you need genuine communication and reason to breach through the conflicting rationalities that exist within those communities.
Far from knowing what it's like to believe in Revelation, that they don't believe anyone else does. Right? So when you tell them that members of ISIS really believe that if you die in the right circumstances, you get 72 virgins, and you're surrounded by rivers of milk and honey and all the rest. If you go into the ivory tower, you meet people who don't believe that anyone believes that stuff. But if you go into a megachurch, they know people believe that stuff because they believe their own dogmas. Right? That's what it's like to be effortlessly right for not especially good reasons. The fact that you believe a book was written by God, and therefore it's trivially easy for you to understand that someone else believes that, but they just have the wrong book. That's not the.
Why is it 72 virgins though? Like, that's what I want to know. It's not like an infinite number, or it's not like a really high. It's like I mean, we're gonna ask the question of why virgins, and obviously that's going to be some sort of like purism, but like why 72? Like, it just reminds us of like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when he goes like, what's the answer to the life, the universe, and everything, and he's just like 42, and that just becomes the answer to the life, universe, and everything. It just seems like that, doesn't it?
Rational basis for understanding our circumstances that we're looking for.
I'm not saying whether one is right and one is wrong, but one seems to have more commitment in that. And in one battle you're fighting, commitment may be important.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
there may be many reasons why the people who deeply want to love and be rational are absolutely no damn use in that fight. Because they want to preserve their happiness a bit longer, preserve their comfort a bit longer, cannot understand people who genuinely come from a fundamentalist standpoint.
Yeah.
And
there's also other, to steelman their case for a moment, it is understandable to be sensitive to and guilty about the history of colonialism and the reality of racism, and to be so committed to tolerance as your master virtue that you're tempted to tolerate intolerance and not recognize it to be cowardice, which in fact it is.
Making tolerance your core value is much different than making truth your core value, which is an interesting thing, because, and perhaps this is one of the places where you and the fundamentalist radical leftists, let's say, differ, is that the core value that's emerging there is definitely one of tolerance, whereas the core value that you espouse is one of truth. And truth and tolerance are not the same thing.
Yes, it is.
And so it might
Amen.
also,
There's a pursuit of truth and the belief that as a result truth can be found. That it's not a single thing on its own, you just pursue it as a hobby. It's just something you do, but that you believe that at the end of it there is a truth to be found.
Yeah. So Douglas, what do you fear is the case?
I think it's a bit like harsh to say. I mean, like obviously we could say this. like you could always say like the opposite as well for the radical right. You know, if we're talking about the extreme right, and the intolerant extreme right is the perpetuation of a it's not obviously a doctrine based on truth, but a doctrine based on intolerance, on unacceptability. And obviously there is that psychological spectrum of how agreeable you are, and how willing you are, and how, you know, communicable you are as an individual. And we could say that perhaps they both lose themselves in that sense, like, you know, the fascists and the, you know, the tankies, you know, the Stalinists and so on, lose themselves to abstracts in two different sense. And I mean, then again, the Stalinists I don't think are very tolerant at all. I guess what he's talking about is the like, you know, the people who are, you know, fundamentally just losing a sense of normativity because of their agreeableness. They're not willing to stand up for a notion of truth. But then you have the people who are losing a sense of normativity because of the lack of agreeableness. And so what we need is normativity and truth within all institutions. And I think that these are vices. These are obviously, it's kind of like the Aristotelian golden mean. We have the virtue of excess and the virtue of the vice of excess and the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. And these are two aspects of the way in which the right and the left perhaps psychoanalytically exist in terms of community.
Case here, if there were more people like me in the West, right? Well, I'm the outlier here. I'm somehow infected by this overweening commitment to truth and rationality and science, and yet I'm still motivated to worry about jihad. But you're worried that there are many people like me who are oblivious to the
why
problem.
are you worried about it when so many other people who are hypothetically, this is the question you asked, why are you so worried about when there's so many people who are hypothetically like you that don't seem to be worried about it? I mean, maybe you're wrong, and you shouldn't be worried about it. Well, Douglas is obviously worried about it.
One answer is a possibility to my worry at any rate, that we may be living in an era when we are discovering that the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment's values never went very wide and didn't go terribly deep. And this is a very painful realization to make. But not only do we go all around the world and discover that, we find that at home. The roots turn out not...
I think that we live in the antithesis of the Enlightenment. I actually think the Enlightenment's values went deeper than anyone actually realizes. We rejected fundamentally the tenets of our institutions and replaced them with an aesthetic ideal, which was based around, you know, an evaluation of a certain conceptual system. But neither of those systems are rationally justified in and of themselves. So the Enlightenment itself loses normativity and falls into postmodernism as its antithesis, unless it can show why normativity must be justified in itself. And I think that is the synthesis of the postmodern and the Enlightenment.
Not to have gone very deep.
I think that actually kind of happens in Hegel, to be entirely honest with you, and maybe that didn't go deep enough. But, you know, like what we see today is perhaps the perpetuation of the Schopenhauerian, Nietzschean tradition.
In even this society. And that's the problem.
It is a problem, but hence my commitment to making them deeper.
And to reiterate the point, I'd be very happy if it was entirely Sam Harris's.
Maybe I'm overvaluing Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and maybe I need to consider even the Hegelian aspect in the perpetuation of a scientific paradigm, which is incredible, had incredible influence. But I think the real issue, or maybe the real issue existed non-philosophically anyway. Hegel said that at this point there had already been the devaluation of philosophy to just a traditional stance in the time he was writing, in which they weren't valued in and of themselves. And perhaps the real shift happened even prior to Kant, and we are just seeing the philosophical unveiling of a certain kind of rationality that existed in a different institution.
The way down. Okay? I'd have no problem with that. It's just that underneath Sam Harris, it's hell.
Well, I'm also curious.
You know me too well.
I'm curious about something that you
Yeah,
said.
that has to be very carefully edited on YouTube.
in the metaphysic that you outlined, rationality in the service of love. Like, this is an interesting. Like, I'm not sure you get to get away with that because, like, is it rationality or is it love? Because I don't understand the place in your conceptual system for love, given your emphasis on rationality as the mechanism of ethics. So I would say, to the degree that I smuggle in Jesus, which, by the way, isn't accidental in some sense, and I'm fully conscious when I'm doing it, you smuggle in love, and it essentially plays the same role.
Well, no, love is an experienced reality.
Yeah.
I mean, love is a state of consciousness. It's a state of an.
But just because it's a state of consciousness doesn't mean it's a good one.
I wouldn't
Is it
ultimately.
a fact?
Well, it's a fact that one can experience it or not.
Well,
to a very degree.
yeah, but that's not the same thing.
No, it is. No, it is. I mean, there are
It's a
facts.
fact that you can experience something, but the thing that you're experiencing is there's also the thing that you're experiencing as a fact.
Well, no, there are facts about the range of human experiences. I think, and not even just human, just conscious experiences. If we can build.
Call into question the value of the experience is what he should have done.
Computers that
It's
can
been
feel love,
axiological.
and that's not inconceivable, and we'll either succeed in doing that or not. But consciousness admits of a range of experiences, and love is one of the best on offer. It's not the only one we care about, but it's the one that anchors us to a positive commitment to the well-being of other conscious systems. And
But it's not a,
but the crucial thing,
it's not a fact. I agree with you.
it is a fact that loving someone entails their love and its counterfeits, right? People can confuse, romantic, attachment or lust with love, right? So, and the Buddhists are especially good at differentiating these various states of consciousness, and it's this true pleasure, mental pleasure in the company of another that is colored by a commitment to their well-being, a wanting them to be happy, wanting to have their hopes realized, a non-zero-sum commitment or sense of your entanglement with them.
He says that like Buddhists are really good at differentiating that fact, and they are like in terms of altruistic joy, and I think that is true. But so are the Christians in the first place. Like I think Christians and like the idea of love thy neighbor is a very non-romantic and platonic concept. It exists between humanity itself. It is love itself abstracted from any given relationship, and it's present in all relationships. It's universal. So I mean, it exists in Christianity as well.
And you can see your failures to love. You can be with people who you think you love. I'm with my best friend, say, and I just find out something fantastic has happened for him, let's say in his career, and I feel a moment of envy. Say, well, then you see, well, okay, how much do you love this person if your first reaction to something good happening to them is you feel poorer for it, right?
That's the Cain and Abel story.
Exactly. So these are all kinds of defects you can witness in your own mind. And yes, you pay enough attention to what it's like to be you. The full horror show of an almost biblical unwinding of all possibility is available. And you add psychedelics to that cocktail, and it gets even more vivid. But
so are you saying
this is it?
These
are facts about the human mind, and it is also factual to say that it is possible to navigate in this space. It is possible to design institutions and social systems and ethical commitments that help us navigate in this space. It's not that we all have to get up every morning naked and try to rebuild civilization and all of human wisdom for ourselves each day. We inherit the most useful tools. You don't have to figure this all out for yourself. And my appeal to you...
But only in our institutions. We don't inherit it in our individual reasoning, in our caprice. We inherit it in our engagement with each other.
Is that we should want to use all the best tools available without hamstringing ourselves by this notion that certain tools must be the best for all time, or certain books must be read on every page with equal diligence because this book came from the creator of the universe. When we're reading Marcus Aurelius, if he gets something catastrophically wrong on page 17, we say, well, what the hell? He lived 2,000 years ago. There's no way he knew everything, right? And we turn the page.
Okay, so,
we can't do that with the Bible.
So here's a mythological...
We can do that with the Bible. You can do that with the Quran. They're just not doing it yet, depending upon the... Like, I don't see very many Enlightenment-esque Muslim communities. It's very fundamentalist. I actually had a conversation with a Muslim not too long ago at Newcastle University. They're trying to convert people to Islam, and I just asked them the UFO dilemma. I was like, well, I'm a third year philosophy student undergrad, so I've got to do UFO, on them. Just like I'm like, so what is it that it makes God, God's, the what is good? Is it good because God says it is good, or is it good and that's why God says it's good? And they were like, oh, I don't know what you mean. I was like, well, if God was to command you to do something like murder, would it be good? Or like, could God not command that? And they were like, oh no, it would be good. And it's like, well, that is inherently irrational, right? Because now it's good in and of itself. It's circular. Rather than it being good in and of itself, and that's why God commands it, which is kind of like the way out. But that dogmatism is ultimately, I think, an issue. I think with Islam, and I think it's an issue for all fundamentalist religions. And I think as well, we need to understand that an absolute rejection of Islam for communities in the Middle East is not the way to go. It will lead to not only a resurgence of Islam in its most dogmatic understanding, it will lead to almost a fascistic interpretation of the scripture, but it will also prevent any real moral progress through the institutions. It will destroy the institutions and force them to have to be re-established. And the only individuals that are going to be able to re-establish institutions are those individuals with concepts. Either that, or it's going to have to establish a new state, which is going to have to require some sort of heroic morality in which some individual comes along and just says, look, this is what we're doing now. And both are a form of dogmatism. And I think that Islam, as much as I disagree with a lot of the ethics within it, it does have value. And rationally, we can pick out the good bits of Islam and perpetuate it in exactly the same way that we would do with Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, any other religion as a whole.
Representation of that. So there's an ancient idea a very ancient idea that when you face the void, what you do is confront it and leap into it. And what you discover at the bottom is a beast, and inside that beast you discover your father lying dead, and then you reanimate your father and you bring him back to the surface, and that's the means of dealing with the void, right? And so, in essence, in some sense, that's just what you said. You said that.
Except that again, there's something confabulatory about that, because you can do. I could change the valence of virtually every word you use there, and it would also sound profound and true. I could swap father for mother, and I could swap void for mountaintop, and it could be the same seemingly archetypal journey. And
it's not that easy. No, it's not that easy, Sam. Like that's the same thing.
It's damn easy. I've done it with a cookbook.
But look, if it's that easy, then you can write great novels.
No,
and you
no,
can tell great stories.
there
Well,
are
if it's that easy, it's not that easy
abilities
to write a
involved.
great story. So these things can't be swapped out with ease. And there is a reason that it's your father that you rescue from the belly of the beast and not your mother in those sorts of situations.
But
so it is akin to.
Again, I give you Buddhism and Hinduism that have completely different iconographies and mythologies. And
Well, they're different at some levels, but not at all. It's like languages. They're different at some levels, but not at all.
They're crucially opposite in many of these cases. I'm just saying that this kind of reading meaning into story there's a reason why it's not science. Because it is, in some basic sense, unfalsifiable. There's nothing you and I can do for the rest of our lives to be sure that the mother isn't at the bottom of that void, and it's really the
Is it
father.
possible to develop a factual approach to the analysis of literature?
Well, yes, on its own terms. You can say, well, but that extends to things like it is a fact that Hamlet was the prince of Denmark. And not
No, I meant
king,
in terms of the
right?
meaning of literature.
Well, yeah, but you can make true and false claims, or more or less plausible.
Yes, I think there is a fundamental meaning in terms of language as a whole and the concepts that are being expressed. There is a fundamental meaning to good, not just an expression of a language game. It implies the existence of something, and that's hermeneutic in nature.
Claims about literature.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Or it's a
Fundamentally,
effects on
the
you. But again, this is a
rejection
very
of
different game than
fundamentalism
what
as well.
most religious people think is on offer.
Believe it or not.
Well, look, if you look at the domain of science, most scientists aren't very good at what they do. And if you look at the domain of religious thinking, most religious thinking people aren't very good at what they do, but that doesn't mean that the whole damn thing should be thrown out. There's gradations of religious revelation and wisdom.
But there's that word, because revelation, if revelation is something that we can all do, you, me, and Marcus Aurelius, right? That is a very different world than the world that Muslims think they're living in.
But you just said, Sam, that we have to go in. This is why I used the going down into the void to rescue your father metaphor. You just said that we have to, and you said this before, and I know you believe it as well, that we have to go back into the past and find the wisdom that can help guide us, because we don't have to do this as if we're encountering everything for the first time. And that's exactly the idea of going into the void to rescue your father. That's how that is the eternal, age-old medication for the confrontation of the void. And you said it yourself, and so I don't know which it is. It's like, do we have to go into the past to rescue what's best, given the understanding that there is something there worth rescuing, or not? Is it pure rationality and nothing else moving forward, unconstrained by convention?
It's just, again, I want our certainties. And I think we all, in every other area of our lives, we agree about this effortlessly. Right? If I'm pretending to be certain of something that you can sense I have no good reason to be certain about, you begin to mistrust me in every area. If it's in business, or if it's in sports, or if I told you I knew that France was going to win the World Cup and I was absolutely sure, and yet I magically didn't bet any money on it. These are conversations we can have about everything else. And yet on this topic of religion, people change the rules. Right?
Yeah, I think that everything needs to be rational, rationally instantiated.
And I'm just arguing that the rules by which we dole out our credence shouldn't change. And they don't change. And again, we shouldn't be misled by the
rules can change. Like the rules in the expression of logic can change, but in the relationship that logic has to our understanding of like logos and what moves logic in the first place and our understanding of reality.
Duration of the past. I mean, this is the comparison of something like Scientology to Christianity is so invidious because we can practically meet L. Ron Hubbard, right? We've got film of him confabulating about the galaxies ruled by overlords whose names he magically knew, right? We see the man behind the curtain. We don't see that with the Apostle Paul or anyone else who brought us the quote, real religions. And yet, it's always just been human beings doing this, right? And if you go back far enough, they were doing it in a situation that was completely uncontaminated by the kinds of concerns we have as scientists and secular rational people for evidence and consistency and a knowledge of the past. I mean, they had nothing they had no mechanism by which to record their observations.
No,
and,
I'm going to interrupt you.
Yes.
Because first of all, I saw a sign saying 5 minutes.
Yes.
And I'm very conscious of a number of things, apart from my own silence. And the main one is this. We had a long session on love just then, and I refused to finish this evening on such a positive note. And I'd like to turn that around. We're all in agreement on certain aspects, free speech, civilized discourse on the most important matters, and much more. But there's also, I'm sure, a lot we have in common of what we just can't bear. And I just wanted to hand over to both of you at some point to give an idea, not of your loves, but of your present hates. That's Jordan.
Hates. Well, I would say that I spent a lot of time over the last 30 years trying to understand the part of me that could be deeply satisfied as an Auschwitz prison guard. And I would say that that part is something that's worthy of hate. And I think the best way to overcome it is to recognize it in yourself and to do everything possible to constrain it. And that's what's given me an overwhelming horror, both of the nihilistic void and the catastrophes of totalitarianism. And the reason that I've turned to the degree that I have to the analysis of religious traditions, not losing my scientific perspective in the meantime, is because I've done everything I could to extract out the wisdom necessary to understand how to deal with that bit of unredeemed evil that every bit of us possess.
Pretty good answer. I like it.
Well, I would say that I hate unnecessary suffering, and especially my capacity for it. And I see so much of my time, conscious time, moment to moment, devoted to this experience that should be familiar to all of you, which is to be captured by thoughts of the past or the future, which are which almost by definition have a mediocrity so transcendent that it's just it is what makes human life just pure monotony and pettiness, and everything that religion advertises itself as a corrective to. Right? So, I mean, what I'm sensitive to is that someone like Sayyid Qutb, when he came to this is Osama bin Laden's favorite philosopher, when he came to America in the 50s, he saw his hosts and their neighbors spending all their time, bragging about how well mowed their lawns were and what new Chevrolets they had purchased, and he looked at all of this as it's just a quintessence of desecration and lost opportunity and the lack of profundity, and for him the corrective obviously was Islam. And half of that is right. It's possible to be totally captivated by the wrong things in this life, and to make yourself not. So obviously, being a guard at Auschwitz with a clear conscience is the extreme case of that.
Happiness.
What was that?
Or being a guard at Auschwitz with happiness.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Worse still, right? So that's the extreme case, and to realize that job was not only filled by psychopaths, right? That psychologically normal people could be brought to that point. I recognize that that's the situation we're in, but most of us live our lives in a different place where it's just mediocrity and pettiness and needless anxiety, and very dimly we recognize the possibility of overcoming that on a day-to-day basis. And honestly, I think the atheism, the lack of belief, the lack of faith in an afterlife, for instance, the lack of belief in the notion that you get everything you want or may get everything you want after you die, and leads to greater depth rather than to superficiality here. So when I kiss my daughters goodnight, right, it is with the understanding that I may never see them again, right? It's not with the assumption that if the roof caves in, we'll all be reunited in heaven along with our pets, right? Which is what many people find consoling about faith. But that, and so what I would say, what I hate in myself and what I hate in our culture is everything that conspires to make the preciousness and sacredness of the present moment difficult to realize. And that's the tide against which I keep pushing.
I'm not going to answer my own question, primarily because of the length of the list and the knowledge of the time. But I would say that if there's one thing I hate, it's the fact that conversations like this, civil discussion on the most important matters between people who have enormous amounts in common and have important disagreements, which engage with the past and which are going to be facilitated for a long time by a knowledge of all the extraordinary progress we're about to hit, can take place in an arena like this with an audience like you, who have all come out and now sat here for 2 hours. And I think it's, at any rate from my point of view, one of the most positive things I can imagine in the world at the moment, that an evening like this is happening with an audience like you.
Yes, thank you.
And unless either of you want to say anything, I think on behalf of all of us, I'd just like to say what a thrill this is for us, and thank you to you. And I hope that this is an example of a constructive discussion of a kind that might even at some point catch on.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Everyone, please put your hands together for Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and Douglas Murray.
Thanks, Gordon.
Yeah, man, that was good. I actually really enjoyed that conversation. I think that they both made some really great points. I thought that the discussion itself was genuinely valuable. I think that I probably agree with Peterson more than Harris, but I think that has more to do with Peterson's understanding of religion being an enlightened understanding of religion. Thank you for your follow. I think that both of them have terrible metaphysical stances, very reductionist and physicalist in origin in many ways, at least it seems. Peterson maybe a bit less so, but at the same time they're not. I don't agree with that metaphysics, but I think that Peterson's understanding of logos and the movement through institutions and movement towards truth is great. I don't know whether that would justify Christianity as much as it would justify ethical institutions as a whole, and mythology as a whole, and the appreciation of one's socio-historical environment in relation to our ethical institutions and the concepts we use. But I do think that it at least entails the non-rejection of all socio-politically embedded traditions because of the institutions and the aesthetic from which they arise. So just because Christianity has issues doesn't mean that we should reject everything in it. And I think that at least that is crippling towards Harris's position. So I would probably give this to Peterson rather than Harris. But at the same time, I do think that Harris did a pretty good job. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, I'm actually going to shoot off straight away after this. I've been doing it for like nearly 4 hours now. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you wish to support the channel, then please consider supporting it via the Streamlabs donation link or PayPal. And through that, I will be buying a new camera so the camera doesn't keep flickering on and off. And I really do hope that we can, perpetuate more conversations like this and engage in more conversations like this and on important issues. So I found it very interesting, and I will be doing more of these streams. So yeah, thank you all, and thank you all for watching. And remember,